Hello everyone, and welcome to Tales by Imon. Tonight, we delve into a story of shifting identities and blurred realities. A story that asks the question, if you woke up with a different face, would you still be you? Let us begin the first chapter of The Man Who Woke Up with a New Face. The stale, recycled air of the cheap motel room was the first thing that registered in Jacob's consciousness. It was a familiar scent, a depressing cocktail of old cigarette smoke, industrial-strength disinfectant, and the faint, lingering sweetness of despair. He'd smelled it in a dozen towns, 100 different rooms just like this one. For a traveling salesman peddling high-end ergonomic office chairs, this was the smell of another Tuesday. He cracked an eyelid, the sliver of morning light piercing the gap in the heavy, faded curtains felt like a hot needle against his retina. He groaned, a low, guttural sound that was more animal than human. His head throbbed with the dull, persistent ache of a hangover he hadn't earned. He didn't drink, not anymore. Not since the accident. He pushed himself up, the cheap polyester sheets clinging to his skin like a second, sweat-soaked hide. The room swam into a blurry focus. A single scarred wooden chair stood sentinel in the corner, its vinyl seat torn and spilling a sad tuft of yellowed foam. The television, a relic from the last century, was perched precariously on a chipped laminate dresser. Beside it, his worn leather briefcase and the rumpled gray suit he'd worn yesterday. Everything was as it should be, a symphony of transient mediocrity. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his bare feet meeting the surprisingly cold, slightly sticky linoleum floor. He needed coffee. Black. And a gallon of it. He stumbled towards the bathroom, his reflection in the tarnished mirror above the sink a hazy, indistinct blur. He fumbled for the light switch, the sudden harsh fluorescent glare making him wince. He squinted, waiting for his eyes to adjust, for the familiar tired face of Jacob Miller to resolve itself from the morning fog. But the face that stared back at him was not his own. He blinked. Once. Twice. The face in the mirror remained unchanged. It was a stranger's face. The eyes were a startling, piercing blue, a stark contrast to his own muddy hazel. The nose was sharper, more aquiline, with a slight, almost imperceptible crook to the bridge, as if it had been broken and healed imperfectly. The jaw was stronger, more defined, dusted with a day's worth of dark stubble that his own perpetually boyish face could never seem to muster. The hair was a thick, unruly mop of dark brown, a stark departure from his own thinning, sandy blonde locks. This was not the face of a man who sold chairs for a living. This was the face of a man who broke hearts, or bones, or both. A wave of vertigo washed over him, and he gripped the edges of the porcelain sink to steady himself, his knuckles turning white. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. This had to be a dream, a nightmare, a bizarre, stress-induced hallucination brought on by too many lonely nights in too many nameless towns. He closed his eyes, took a deep, shuddering breath, and counted to 10. He could feel the cool, smooth surface of the sink beneath his fingertips, the dull ache in his temples, the rough texture of the unfamiliar stubble on his chin. It all felt terrifyingly real. He opened his eyes again. The stranger was still there, his expression a mixture of confusion and dawning horror that mirrored Jacob's own. He reached up a trembling hand and touched his face. The man in the mirror did the same. The sensation was surreal. The skin felt right. It felt like his own. But it wasn't. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass. He could see the fine lines around the stranger's eyes, the small, faded scar that bisected his left eyebrow. He had no such scar. He had a small mole just below his right ear, a harmless little imperfection his wife, Emily, used to playfully call his off button. He reached for it, his fingers fumbling against smooth, unblemished skin. The mole was gone. A strangled cry escaped his lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated panic. He stumbled back, away from the mirror, away from the impossible face that stared back at him. He tripped over the edge of the threadbare bath mat and landed hard on the cold, unforgiving floor. He scrambled backwards, crab-walking until his back hit the cool, tiled wall. He sat there, gasping for breath, his mind a chaotic whirlwind of disbelief and terror. This wasn't possible. It was a prank. A cruel, elaborate joke. But who would do this? And how? He was in a locked motel room in the middle of nowhere, Nebraska. He hadn't spoken to anyone since checking in last night. He hadn't seen a single soul. He fumbled in the pocket of his discarded trousers, his fingers closing around the reassuringly familiar shape of his wallet. He pulled it out, his hands shaking so violently he could barely open it. His driver's license. His name. Jacob Miller. But the face smiling placidly back at him from the laminated plastic was his old face. The face he had gone to bed with. The face he had lived with for 38 years. He looked from the license to the mirror, then back again. The disconnect was jarring, a cognitive dissonance that made his stomach churn. It was like looking at two different people who were somehow, impossibly, the same person. Him. He was Jacob Miller. But who was the man in the mirror? He crawled back to the sink, pulling himself up with a strength he didn't know he possessed. He had to be sure. He had to find something, anything, that was familiar. He opened his mouth. His teeth. They were his teeth. A little crooked on the bottom, a slight chip on his left incisor from a childhood bicycle accident. A small, insignificant detail, but it was his. He ran his tongue over them, the familiar landscape a tiny island of normalcy in a sea of utter madness. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough to quell the rising tide of panic that threatened to drown him. He splashed cold water on his new face, the unfamiliar planes and angles a strange and unsettling topography beneath his fingertips. He looked up again, water dripping from his chin, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. The man in the mirror looked just as lost, just as terrified. And in that moment, a new, even more terrifying thought began to take root in his mind. What if this wasn't a dream? What if this wasn't a prank? What if this was real? What if, somehow impossibly, he had woken up with a new face? And if he had a new face, was he still Jacob Miller? Or was he someone else entirely? The questions echoed in the small, sterile bathroom, each one a hammer blow against his already fractured sense of self. And he had no answers. Not a single one. Just the face of a stranger staring back at him from the other side of the glass. And the terrifying, dawning realization that his life, as he knew it, was over. The first rays of dawn were beginning to paint the grimy motel window in shades of gray and pale orange, signaling the start of a day that Jacob was in no way prepared to face. He was still on the bathroom floor, the cold tile a stark and unwelcome reality against his skin. His mind, which had been a maelstrom of panic and disbelief, was slowly, painstakingly, beginning to function again. He needed a plan. He needed to think. But how could he think when the very foundation of his identity had been ripped out from under him? He pushed himself to his feet, his joints protesting with a chorus of creaks and groans. He avoided the mirror, his gaze fixed on the peeling paint on the wall. He couldn't look at that face again. Not yet. He needed to focus on what he knew. His name was Jacob Miller. He was 38 years old. He was married to a woman named Emily. They lived in a small two-story house in a quiet suburb of Chicago. He sold ergonomic office chairs. These were the facts. These were the anchors he had to cling to in this storm of unreality. He dressed in the rumpled gray suit from yesterday, the familiar fabric a small comfort against his skin. The clothes fit, which was both a relief and a source of profound unease. It meant that his body, at least from the neck down, was still his own. It was a small mercy, but he would take it. He packed his briefcase, his movements slow and deliberate, a man going through the motions of a life that no longer felt like his. He checked out of the motel, the bored-looking clerk barely glancing up from her crossword puzzle. He paid in cash, his voice a hoarse, unfamiliar croak. He didn't want to use his credit card. He didn't want to leave a paper trail. Not until he figured out what was going on. He sat in his car, a sensible, mid-sized sedan that suddenly felt as alien as his own reflection. He stared at his hands on the steering wheel. They were his hands. He recognized the calluses on his palms, the small scar on his right thumb from a kitchen knife accident a few years back. He flexed his fingers, the familiar movement a small reassurance. But when he looked in the rearview mirror, the stranger's face was there, his blue eyes wide with a fear that was all Jacob's. He had to go home. He had to see Emily. She would know him. She would look past this mask, and see the man she had married. She had to. The thought was a desperate prayer, a flicker of hope in the overwhelming darkness. He pulled out of the motel parking lot, the gravel crunching under his tires, and pointed the car east, towards Chicago. Towards home. Or what he hoped was still home. The drive was a blur of highways and truck stops, of endless miles of flat, featureless landscape that mirrored the emptiness in his soul. He drove on autopilot, his mind a frantic, looping replay of the morning's events. He tried to come up with a rational explanation. A rare, undiagnosed medical condition. A side effect of some medication he didn't know he'd taken. A psychotic break. But none of it fit. None of it felt right. The truth, however impossible, was the only thing that remained. He had gone to sleep as Jacob Miller, and woken up as someone else. He stopped for gas at a grimy roadside station, the air thick with the smell of gasoline and fried food. He caught a glimpse of his reflection in the car window and flinched. He still wasn't used to it. He probably never would be. He went inside to pay, his head down, avoiding eye contact with the cashier. But as he was leaving, a man holding a newspaper did a double take. He stared at Jacob, his eyes wide with a look of dawning recognition. "Hey," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. "I know you." Jacob's blood ran cold. He froze, his hand on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. I don't think so," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Yeah, I do," the man insisted, taking a step closer. You're that guy. From the news." The news. Jacob's mind raced. He hadn't been on the news. He was a nobody. A chair salesman. What was this man talking about? "You're mistaken," Jacob said, his voice a little stronger this time. He had to get out of there. He had to get away from this man and his impossible claims. But the man was persistent. He pointed a greasy finger at Jacob's face. "No, I ain't. I seen your picture all over. You're that writer. The one who disappeared." Writer? Disappeared. This was insane. It had to be a mistake. A case of mistaken identity. But then, wasn't that what his entire morning had been? A case of mistaken identity, played out on the canvas of his own face? "I'm sorry," Jacob said, his voice trembling. "You have the wrong person." He turned and fled, not waiting for a reply. He jumped into his car, his hands fumbling with the keys. He could feel the man's eyes on him, his gaze a physical weight on his back. He peeled out of the gas station, his tires squealing in protest, and didn't look back. But the man's words echoed in his mind, a new and terrifying piece of a puzzle he didn't know how to solve. A writer. The one who disappeared. Was it possible? Was this face not just a random collection of features, but a face that belonged to someone? Someone real? And if so, who was he? And where was the man whose face he now wore? The questions swirled in his head, a dizzying vortex of fear and confusion. He was no longer just a man with a new face. He was a man with a stolen face. And he was driving towards a home that might not be his, to a wife who might not recognize him, with the face of a man who was, according to a stranger at a gas station, missing. The road ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, each mile taking him further into a mystery that was as deep and as terrifying as the reflection in his rearview mirror. And for the first time, he began to wonder if he would ever find his way back. The stranger's words, "the one who disappeared," became a relentless echo in the confines of Jacob's sedan. They bounced off the windshield and rattled in his skull, each repetition chipping away at the fragile hope that this was all just a bad dream. A writer. A missing writer. The idea was absurd, yet it clung to him with a chilling persistence. He drove for what felt like hours, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. The face in the mirror was no longer just a stranger. It was now a ghost, a mystery with a name he didn't know and a story he was now terrifyingly a part of. He felt like an imposter in his own skin, a thief who hadn't meant to steal anything. Paranoia began to set in, a cold and creeping vine. Every car that stayed behind him for too long became a potential threat. Was someone following him? Did they know who he was? Or rather, who they thought he was? He saw a police car parked on the median, and his heart leaped into his throat. He instinctively slowed down, his hands slick with sweat. He was Jacob Miller, a law-abiding citizen, a seller of office furniture. He had done nothing wrong. But his face, this face, might have. What if this missing writer wasn't just missing? What if he was wanted? The thought sent a jolt of pure ice through his veins. For the first time, he considered turning back, disappearing into the anonymity of the road. But the thought of Emily, of his home, was the one lighthouse in his storm-tossed mind. He had to know. He had to see her. He finally pulled off the highway at a small, secluded rest stop, nestled amongst a grove of tall pine trees. He needed a moment to think, to breathe. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. He reached for his briefcase on the passenger seat and pulled out his work laptop. His fingers trembled as he opened it and connected to the rest stop's spotty public Wi-Fi. What was he even looking for? He didn't have a name, just a description. A missing writer. He typed the vague phrase into the search engine, "Writer disappeared United States." The results were a deluge of information, a digital haystack of cold cases and forgotten headlines. He scrolled through dozens of articles, his eyes scanning for anything that might fit. Missing poets, vanished journalists, novelists who had dropped off the grid. None of them seemed right. He was about to give up, to dismiss the gas station encounter as the ramblings of a confused old man, when a headline caught his eye. Acclaimed novelist Julian Croft vanishes from remote cabin. The article was dated 2 weeks ago. He clicked on it, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The page loaded, and a picture appeared alongside the text. It was a professional headshot, a black and white photo of a man with piercing eyes, a strong jaw, and a thick mop of dark, unruly hair. A small, faded scar bisected his left eyebrow. Jacob felt the air leave his lungs in a rush, as if he'd been punched in the gut. He was staring at his own face. The face from the mirror. It was him. Or rather, it was Julian Croft. He read the article with a kind of detached horror, the words blurring together. Croft was a critically acclaimed author known for his dark, psychological thrillers. He had been on a solo writing retreat in a remote cabin in the Colorado mountains when he had simply vanished. His car was still there, the cabin was locked from the inside, and there were no signs of a struggle. He had left behind a half-finished manuscript, a pot of cold coffee, and nothing else. The police were baffled. Foul play was suspected, but there was no evidence. He had disappeared into thin air. Jacob leaned back in his seat, the laptop feeling impossibly heavy on his legs. So, he had a name for the face. Julian Croft. A man who, by all accounts, was gone. Possibly dead. And now, Jacob was wearing his face. How was this possible? Was it some kind of bizarre, cosmic joke? Had he somehow absorbed this man's identity in his sleep? The questions were maddening, unanswerable. He felt a wave of nausea and stumbled out of the car, gasping for the cool pine-scented air. He paced the empty parking lot, his mind reeling. This changed everything. This wasn't just a personal crisis anymore. This was something bigger, something dangerous. Julian Croft had a life, a history. People were looking for him. What would happen when they found Jacob? How could he possibly explain that he was just a simple chair salesman who had woken up with a famous novelist's face? They would think he was insane. Or worse, they would think he was Croft, playing some kind of twisted game. Or even worse, they would think he had something to do with Croft's disappearance. His fear was now a living thing, a cold knot of dread in the pit of his stomach. His first instinct was to run, to take his car, change his name, and drive until he ran out of road. But what about Emily? What about the life he had built? Was he just supposed to abandon it all because of this biological impossibility? No, he couldn't. He wouldn't. He had to go home. He had to tell Emily. Together, they could figure this out. She was practical, level-headed. She would help him find a logical explanation. She had to believe him. With a newfound, albeit fragile, resolve, he got back in the car. The face in the rearview mirror seemed to mock him, the ghost of Julian Croft, a constant, silent passenger. Jacob ignored it, focusing on the road, on the image of his wife's face, the real familiar face he desperately needed to see. As he merged back onto the highway, the suburbs of Chicago finally appearing on the horizon, he rehearsed the words he would say to Emily. He tried to imagine the conversation, the shock, the disbelief, the eventual understanding. He clung to that imagined outcome like a drowning man clings to a piece of driftwood. The final stretch of the drive was the longest. He navigated the familiar streets of his neighborhood, each turn a mix of comfort and terror. The manicured lawns, the cookie-cutter houses, the children playing in the street. It was all so painfully normal, a stark contrast to the surreal nightmare his life had become. He pulled into his driveway, his heart threatening to beat its way out of his chest. The house looked exactly the same. Emily's car was there. A light was on in the living room window. She was home. He sat in the car for a long time, his hand on the door handle, unable to move. This was the moment of truth. The next few minutes would determine the rest of his life. Would she scream? Would she call the police? Or would she look into Julian Croft's eyes and see the man she loved? He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air tasting of fear and gasoline. He had to know. He opened the car door and stepped out, the gravel crunching under his shoes with an air of finality. He walked up the familiar stone path to his front door, his keys feeling foreign in his hand. He looked at his reflection one last time in the dark glass of the door. A stranger stared back, his expression grim, his blue eyes filled with a desperate, silent plea. He closed his eyes, said a silent prayer, and put the key in the lock. The lock clicked, a sound that seemed thunderously loud in the quiet suburban evening. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Jacob stood frozen on the welcome mat, his own front door suddenly the most intimidating barrier he had ever faced. He could hear the faint, muffled sound of the television from inside, a sitcom laugh track that felt jarringly out of place with the frantic drumming of his own heart. He pushed the door open, the familiar creak of the hinges a ghost of a life that felt a million miles away. The warm, inviting air of his home washed over him, smelling of lemon polish and the dinner Emily was probably keeping warm. The entryway was exactly as he'd left it 2 days ago. His worn-out sneakers were by the door, a stack of mail sat on the small console table, and a framed photo of him and Emily on their wedding day hung on the wall. In the picture, the old Jacob, his Jacob, was smiling, his arm wrapped securely around his wife, his hazel eyes crinkling at the corners. He stared at the photo, a wave of profound loss washing over him. It was like looking at a picture of a dead man. "Jacob, is that you? You're home early," Emily's voice called out from the living room. It was the sweetest sound he had ever heard, a lifeline. It's me," he called back, but the voice that came out was wrong. It was deeper, rougher, the voice of Julian Croft. It sounded alien in his own home. He heard the soft padding of her footsteps on the hardwood floor before she appeared in the doorway of the living room. She was wiping her hands on a dish towel, a welcoming smile on her face. The smile vanished the instant she saw him. It didn't just fade, it was wiped clean, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. Her eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth. The dish towel fluttered to the floor. "Who are you?" she breathed, her voice a thin, terrified whisper. She took a step back, her body tensing as if preparing to flee. "How did you get in my house?" Her reaction was a physical blow. He had expected shock, confusion, even disbelief. But he hadn't been prepared for the raw terror in her eyes. The look she was giving him was the look you give a home invader, a monster. "Emily, please," he said, taking a step forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "It's me. It's Jacob." "No," she shook her head, her eyes darting towards the phone on the kitchen counter. "No, you're not. Get out of my house right now or I'm calling the police." "Listen to me," he pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "I know this sounds crazy. I know I don't look like myself. But I swear to you, it's me. Something happened. I woke up this morning, and I had this face." He sounded like a lunatic. He knew it. The words felt flimsy and absurd even as he said them. He saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes warring with her fear. She was looking at him, really looking at him, searching for any sign of the man she knew. But all she saw was a stranger. A dangerous stranger who knew her name. "Prove it," she challenged, her voice trembling but firm. "If you're Jacob, prove it. Tell me something only he would know." His mind went blank for a second, the panic seizing his thoughts. Then, memories flooded in. Okay. The first time we met, at that awful little coffee shop downtown, you spilled a latte all over my resume. You were so embarrassed you insisted on buying me a new shirt. Her expression didn't change. "A lucky guess. Our first real date," he pressed on, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "We went to see that terrible sci-fi movie, the one with the robot aliens, and the projector broke halfway through. We spent the rest of the night walking along the lakefront, and you told me about your grandmother, how she taught you how to identify all the constellations. You pointed out Orion's belt." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a crack in the wall of her fear. "What did I call it?" she whispered. "You called it the celestial saucepan," he answered immediately, "because you could never remember the real name." Her hand lowered slightly from her mouth. Her breathing was still ragged, but the immediate terror was beginning to recede, replaced by a profound, unnerving confusion. She stared at him, her gaze so intense it felt like he was being physically examined. "Your scar," she said, her voice barely audible. "The one on your thumb. From the carving knife at Thanksgiving 2 years ago. Show me." He held out his right hand, turning it over so she could see the small, silvery line on his thumb. It was his. It was proof. A tiny piece of his old self that this new face hadn't erased. He saw her eyes lock onto it, and for the first time, a sliver of recognition seemed to dawn. "How?" she whispered, the single word hanging in the air between them, heavy with impossibility. "Jacob, is it really you?" He nodded, a wave of relief so powerful it made his knees weak. "It's me, Em. I swear it's me." She didn't run to him, didn't embrace him. She stood frozen, her mind clearly struggling to reconcile the impossible. She was looking at the face of a stranger, but she had just heard the memories of her husband. The two realities were at war, and she was caught in the crossfire. He took another slow, deliberate step towards her. "I'm scared, Emily. I don't know what's happening." Finally, she moved. She didn't run away. She walked slowly, cautiously, towards him, as one might approach a wild, unpredictable animal. She stopped just out of arm's reach, her eyes scanning his new face, searching for a ghost, for a trace of the man she had married. She looked into his eyes, the piercing blue eyes of Julian Croft, and he poured every ounce of love, fear, and desperation he felt into his gaze, hoping she would see past the color, past the shape, and find him in there. Tell me about the dream, she said softly, her voice still laced with a fragile disbelief. The one you have. The one you never tell anyone about. He knew instantly which one she meant. The recurring nightmare that had haunted him since the accident that had taken his parents. The car, he said, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. I'm in the back seat. It's raining. I can't see their faces, just the back of their heads. The radio is playing that old song my dad loved. American Pie. And then the headlights. They're so bright. Tears welled in Emily's eyes, and they were not tears of fear. They were tears of anguish, of recognition, of a reality so fractured it was breaking her heart. Oh my God, she sobbed, a choked, broken sound. It really is you. Emily's acceptance wasn't a magic wand. It didn't erase the stranger's face staring back at Jacob from every reflective surface in their home. It didn't solve the impossible mystery of what had happened to him. But it was an anchor. Her belief, fragile as it was the only thing keeping him from being completely swept away by the tide of madness. The dam of his composure finally broke, and he sagged against the doorframe, the emotional exhaustion of the day hitting him with the force of a physical blow. She didn't embrace him. The hesitation was still there, a chasm between the man she knew and the man she saw. Instead, she guided him to the kitchen table, her touch on his arm light and uncertain. She sat him down in his usual chair, a small act of normalcy that felt both comforting and deeply ironic. She made coffee, her movements stiff and automatic, the familiar domestic ritual a stark contrast to the surreal horror of their situation. The silence in the kitchen was thick with unasked questions, with a reality too vast and terrifying to be contained by the cheerful, yellow walls of their kitchen. I don't understand, she finally said, placing a steaming mug in front of him. She sat opposite, her hands wrapped around her own mug as if for warmth, though the evening was mild. Jacob, how is this possible? Is this a medical thing? Did you see a doctor? He shook his head, the movement feeling heavy and slow. Who would I go to, Em? What would I say? Hello, doctor. I seem to have woken up with the wrong head. They'd lock me in a padded room and throw away the key. This isn't medical. It feels different. It's like something was switched. Replaced. He took a sip of the coffee. It was his coffee, the dark roast he loved, made just the way he liked it. He closed his eyes, focusing on the taste, another tiny island of the familiar. I thought it was a dream. Then I thought I was going crazy. I drove all day just trying to get back here, to you. I thought if you saw me, you'd know me, and maybe it would all just snap back to normal. But it didn't, she stated, her voice flat. It wasn't a question. No, he said quietly. It didn't. He looked at her, at the fear and confusion warring in her beautiful, familiar face. He had to tell her the rest. She deserved to know how much danger they were potentially in. It gets worse, Emily. This face, it's not just a random face. He recounted the stop at the gas station, the man who had recognized him from the news. He told her about the frantic search on his laptop at the rest stop, the headline, and the black and white photo that had confirmed his worst fears. His name is Julian Croft, Jacob said, the name feeling like a foreign object in his mouth. He's a novelist. Apparently a famous one. And 2 weeks ago, he vanished from a cabin in Colorado. The police are looking for him. Everyone is looking for him. Emily stared at him, her face paling. The personal, internal nightmare had just violently crashed into the outside world. This was no longer just about a lost identity. It was about a stolen one. A very public, very sought-after one. You're saying you're wearing the face of a missing person, she whispered, the implications dawning on her. A famous missing person? Yes, he confirmed, his voice grim. Which means anyone, at any time, could recognize me. Or him. That guy at the gas station. It's only a matter of time before it happens again. What do we do when it does? What do we say? Emily stood up and began to pace the small kitchen, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her practical, orderly world had been shattered, and she was struggling to find the pieces. Okay, think. There has to be a rational explanation. Plastic surgery. Some kind of advanced prosthetic. While I was sleeping in a locked motel room in Nebraska? Jacob countered gently, without a single stitch or a mark on me. No, it's not that. I felt my face this morning. It's my skin, my muscles. It just isn't mine. Her pacing grew more agitated. So what does that mean? Where is he? This Julian Croft? And more importantly, where is you? Your face? That was the question, the black hole at the center of it all. If he had Julian Croft's face, did that mean Julian Croft had his? The thought was dizzying. Was there another man out there, a stranger, walking around with the face of Jacob Miller? Was he confused and terrified, trying to get back to a life in the Colorado mountains? Or was something more sinister at play? Croft's thrillers, according to the articles, were dark and psychological. What if life had imitated art? I don't know, Jacob admitted, feeling utterly helpless. Maybe his disappearance and what happened to me are connected. Maybe they're a coincidence. I have no idea. All I know is that I'm here in this body, with this face, and I'm terrified of what happens next. Emily stopped pacing and looked at him, her eyes filled with a fierce determination that momentarily overshadowed her fear. No, we are terrified. We're in this together, Jacob. We'll figure it out. She came back to the table and, for the first time since he'd walked through the door, she reached out and took his hand. His hand. The one part of him that was still visibly, tangibly his. Her touch was hesitant at first, then her grip tightened, a silent promise of solidarity. First thing, she said, her voice taking on a practical, commanding tone that he knew so well. No one can see you. You can't leave the house. We'll call your work tomorrow and tell them you have the flu, a really bad case. We need to buy ourselves some time. And then what? He asked. We can't hide forever. Eventually, someone's going to come looking for Jacob Miller or Julian Croft. I know, she said, her gaze distant, her mind already working through scenarios and possibilities. We need more information. We need to know everything there is to know about this Julian Croft. His life, his work, his enemies. If his disappearance is linked to what happened to you, the answer has to be somewhere in his life, not yours. She was right. His life was an open book, a simple, unremarkable story. Julian Croft's, however, was a mystery. A mystery he was now the unwilling protagonist of. Tomorrow, Emily said, her grip on his hand unwavering. Tomorrow, we start digging. We become experts on Julian Croft. And we find out who did this to you. Her resolve was a shield, and for the first time since he'd looked in that motel mirror, Jacob felt a flicker of something other than pure terror. It wasn't hope, not yet. But it was a start. He looked at his wife, her familiar face a beacon in the disorienting fog, and held onto her hand as if he were a drowning man. The stranger in the mirror was still there, but for now, in the quiet sanctuary of his own kitchen, he was not alone. The first night was a landscape of surreal domesticity. Sleeping next to Emily, in his own bed, should have been the most natural thing in the world. Instead, it was an exercise in hyper-awareness. Jacob lay rigidly on his side, terrified of turning over and having her wake in the dark to a stranger's profile on the pillow next to her. He could feel the space between them, a gulf of strangeness that had never existed before. He listened to her breathing, the soft, even rhythm of familiar comfort in the terrifying newness of his reality. He wondered what she saw when she closed her eyes. Did she see him, her Jacob? Or was her sleep haunted by the image of the blue-eyed man who had invaded their home? He barely slept, his mind a chaotic slideshow of Julian Croft's face, headlines about his disappearance, and Emily's initial, terrified reaction. Morning brought with it a cold, gray light and the daunting task of beginning their new life as fugitives in their own home. Emily made the call to his boss, her voice a pitch-perfect blend of wifely concern and apology, explaining that Jacob had come down with a severe, contagious flu and would be out of commission for at least a week. The lie came easily, smoothly, and the ease of it was unsettling. It was the first of many they would have to tell. With that one phone call, Jacob Miller, the reliable office chair salesman, officially ceased to exist in the outside world. He was now a ghost, confined to the four walls of his house. They turned the spare bedroom, which had once been a dumping ground for forgotten hobbies and exercise equipment, into what Emily grimly called their war room. They set up his laptop on the dusty desk, pulled down the blinds, and began their descent into the life of Julian Croft. The internet was a treasure trove and a minefield. Articles, interviews, fan wikis, and gossip columns painted a picture of a man who was both a literary celebrity and a recluse. Croft was a master of the psychological thriller. His novels were celebrated for their intricate plots, unreliable narrators, and unsettling explorations of fractured identity and the darkness lurking beneath ordinary lives. Reading the synopses of his books sent a chill down Jacob's spine. The echo of a face. Shadow self. The man who wasn't there. It was as if Croft had spent his entire career writing about the very nightmare Jacob was now living. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. They watched video interviews. It was a profoundly disturbing experience for Jacob, sitting in the dim light of the spare room, watching himself, or rather, the man whose face he wore, speak. Croft's voice was nothing like his. It was a low, measured baritone, thoughtful and articulate, with a faint, unplaceable accent that hinted at a more worldly upbringing. He spoke in long, complex sentences, his blue eyes intense and focused. He was charming, but with a distinct edge, a sense of coiled intellectual energy that made the interviewer, and by extension Jacob, lean in. In one interview, the host asked him about the recurring theme of lost identity in his work. Croft had smiled, a slow, enigmatic smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We all wear masks," he'd said, his voice smooth as silk. "We present a curated version of ourselves to the world. The husband, the writer, the friend. But what happens when the mask sticks? What happens when you look in the mirror and you no longer recognize the person beneath it? Is the mask the reality? Or is the man underneath? And what if there's nothing underneath at all?" The words were so unnervingly close to his own new reality that Jacob had to look away from the screen, his stomach churning. Was this a clue? A philosophical musing? Or just the talk of a writer who delved too deep into the shadows? Emily, ever the pragmatist, focused on the facts. She created a timeline of Croft's life, pulling details from dozens of sources. He was 42, an only child of wealthy, deceased parents. He had no spouse, no children. He was notoriously private, moving frequently and maintaining a very small circle of acquaintances, none of whom could be called close friends. His agent, a woman named Cassandra Thorne, seemed to be his primary point of contact with the outside world. He owned a remote cabin in Colorado, but also a sleek, modern apartment in New York City that he rarely used. He had money, but lived a surprisingly Spartan life. He was a man who seemed to have deliberately erased most of his personal connections, making himself an island. It made him the perfect person to disappear. The more they learned, the more the mystery deepened. There were no jilted lovers, no angry business partners, no obvious enemies. His life, for all its public acclaim, was a blank slate. The police report on his disappearance, which they found on a local Colorado news site, offered nothing new. No forced entry, no signs of a struggle. It was as if he had simply decided to walk out of his life and never return. "This doesn't make any sense," Emily said, late in the afternoon, rubbing her tired eyes as she stared at the screen. "People don't just vanish. And people certainly don't just swap faces." "Maybe he did it himself," Jacob mused, the thought coming to him suddenly. The writer of dark, psychological thrillers stages the ultimate disappearance. He finds a random guy who looks a little bit like him, maybe our builds were similar, and he somehow, I don't know, swaps us. "Swaps you how, Jacob?" she countered, her voice edged with frustration. "With what? Magic. This is the real world. There has to be a real-world explanation." But the more they searched for a logical answer, the more elusive it became. They were adrift in a sea of high strangeness, with no map and no compass. The day wore on, and the spare room began to feel like a bunker. With every article they read, every picture they saw of Julian Croft, Jacob felt his own identity slipping further away. He'd catch his reflection in the dark laptop screen, and the jolt of wrongness was still as sharp as it had been in the motel. He was becoming saturated with another man's life, and he was terrified that he would forget his own. He looked over at Emily, at her brow furrowed in concentration, and he felt a pang of guilt. He had dragged her into this impossible mess. Her life was now as imprisoned as his. "Em," he said softly. She looked up, her eyes weary. "I'm sorry." "Don't," she said, her voice firm. She reached across the desk and placed her hand on his. "This is not your fault. It's something that happened to you, to us, and we are going to fix it. We just need to find a thread, one loose thread to pull on." But as the day bled into another night, and the face of Julian Croft stared back at them from the glowing screen, they both knew that finding that single thread in the vast, tangled tapestry of the novelist's life felt like an impossible task. 3 days passed in a blur of recycled air and digital ghosts. The world outside their drawn blinds continued on, oblivious. Neighbors mowed their lawns, children rode their bikes, the mailman made his daily rounds. For Jacob and Emily, their 2-story suburban house had become a prison, the war room its central cell. The initial frantic energy of their investigation had settled into a grim, exhausting routine. They woke up, drank coffee, and submerged themselves in the life of Julian Croft. They ate meals without tasting them, their conversation a constant, looping analysis of facts that led nowhere. The psychological toll was beginning to show. Jacob found himself avoiding mirrors, not just because of the shock, but because he was starting to get used to the face. That was the most terrifying part. A flicker of acceptance was taking root. He'd raise a hand to scratch an itch on his cheek, and his fingers would know the new landscape of his bones, the unfamiliar texture of the stubble. He was a stranger in his own body, and the stranger was slowly becoming familiar. The lines between Jacob Miller and Julian Croft were beginning to blur in his own mind, and he fought against it with a silent, desperate ferocity. He started having dreams that weren't his own. Fragmented images of a snow-covered landscape, the inside of a sleek, minimalist apartment overlooking a city skyline at night, the satisfying heft of a fountain pen in his hand. He'd wake up with a gasp, his heart pounding, the phantom memories clinging to him like cobwebs before dissolving in the morning light. He didn't tell Emily about them. She was already carrying so much of the burden. He couldn't bring himself to add the terrifying possibility that he was not just wearing Croft's face, but somehow inheriting his memories, too. During their research on the third day, a detail snagged his attention. It was an in-depth magazine profile on Croft, written a year before his disappearance. It mentioned his childhood, his wealthy but emotionally distant parents, and the boarding school in rural Vermont he had attended. The name of the school was Blackwood Preparatory Academy. The moment he read the name, a strange sense of something washed over him. It wasn't a memory, not exactly. It was more like a resonance, a phantom echo in a hollow chamber of his mind. Blackwood. The name felt cold and forbidding, yet deeply familiar. He could almost smell damp stone and old books. "Emily," he said, his voice quiet. "This school, Blackwood, does it mean anything to you?" She glanced at the screen. "No. Should it? Just looks like some fancy East Coast boarding school." "Why?" "I don't know," he admitted, shaking his head to clear the strange feeling. "It just feels like I know it." "Jacob, we've been staring at this guy's life for 72 hours straight," she said gently, her voice laced with fatigue. "We're probably starting to absorb it. It's like studying for a test. You're just getting the material stuck in your head." He knew she was probably right. It was the logical explanation. But it didn't feel logical. It felt innate. He pushed the feeling aside, but it lingered, a quiet, unsettling hum beneath the surface of his thoughts. By the fourth day, Emily's pragmatism was curdling into desperation. They had hit a wall. They had read every article, watched every interview, and analyzed every public detail of Julian Croft's life. They were no closer to an answer than they had been on day one. "This isn't working," she declared, pushing away from the desk with a frustrated sigh. "We're just going around in circles. We're being passive. We're waiting for an answer to fall out of the internet, and it's not going to happen. We need to do something." "Do what, Em?" Jacob asked, gesturing around the shuttered room. "I can't exactly go knocking on doors. One person recognizes this face, and it's all over. We'll be explaining this to the police, and you know how that will end." "I know," she conceded. "But we can't just sit here and wait. We're prisoners. We need to be proactive. We need to get inside his life. Not his public life, his private life." Her eyes had a glint that he hadn't seen in days, the glint of an idea. "His email," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "His social media, if he has any. His bank accounts. Somewhere in his private correspondence, there has to be a clue. A mention of a new project, an argument with someone, a strange appointment. Something that the police missed." The idea sent a jolt of pure fear through Jacob. "Emily, that's insane. We can't just hack into a famous person's accounts. That's a federal crime. And how would we even get the passwords?" "We try," she insisted, her desperation making her bold. "What are his passwords likely to be? Names from his books. His mother's maiden name. His birthday. We know all of that now. We can try the password recovery questions. What was the name of your first pet? We know from that profile his first pet was a golden retriever named Prospero. We have the information, Jacob. We just need to be brave enough to use it." He stared at her, torn between the terrifying risk and the agonizing reality of their current situation. She was right. Hiding in the dark wasn't a solution. It was a slow surrender. They were living on borrowed time, and their savings wouldn't last forever. Sooner or later, the real world would come crashing in. Her plan was reckless, dangerous, and probably illegal, but it was also the only plan they had. It was the only way to take back a small measure of control over a situation that had rendered them completely powerless. "What if we get caught?" he whispered, the fear a tight knot in his stomach. "What if we don't do anything?" she countered, her gaze unwavering. "Then we're just waiting to get caught anyway. At least this way, we're fighting back. We're looking for an answer. For a way to get you back." He looked from her determined face to the image of Julian Croft on the laptop screen. The novelist's enigmatic smile seemed to mock him, challenging him. What happens when you look in the mirror and you no longer recognize the person beneath it? Croft's words echoed in his mind. Jacob Miller would have stayed hidden. He would have played it safe. But he wasn't just Jacob Miller anymore. He was wearing the face of a man who wrote about taking risks, about stepping into the shadows. Maybe it was time he acted the part. Okay, Jacob said, the word feeling momentous as it left his lips. Let's do it. Let's try to break into Julian Croft's life. The decision, once made, filled the small room with a new and potent energy. The stagnant air of passive research was replaced by the electric hum of active trespass. It was terrifying, but it was also a relief. They were finally doing something, pushing back against the suffocating helplessness that had defined their last few days. They started with the most obvious target, Croft's primary email account, the one listed on his author website for professional inquiries, managed by his agent. It was a long shot, but it was a place to start. The login screen stared back at them, a simple, unforgiving portal. User ID, J. Croft. Password. That was the wall. Emily created a systematic list in a notebook, a methodical approach to their criminal endeavor. They tried everything they could think of. The titles of his novels, in every conceivable variation. Shadow Self, The Echo of a Face, The Man Who Wasn't There One. Nothing. They tried the names of his main characters, Elias, Anya, the Janus. Access denied. They moved on to personal details. His birthday. His parents' names. Prospero, the golden retriever. Each attempt was met with the same cold, digital rejection. The security questions were even more opaque. What is your most treasured ambition? Who was your greatest inspiration? These weren't questions with factual answers they could find in an article. They were questions about the man's soul, a place they had no access to. Hours bled into one another. The initial adrenaline faded, replaced by a grinding frustration. With each failed attempt, the wall seemed to grow higher. They were locked out, not just from his email, but from any chance of understanding the mystery that had consumed their lives. Jacob paced the room, the nervous energy too much to contain, while Emily methodically worked her way down the list, her jaw set with determination. It's no good, she finally said, her voice heavy with defeat as the website temporarily locked them out for too many failed attempts. His digital security is as private as the rest of his life. We're not getting in this way. Jacob stopped pacing and stared at the screen, at the mocking "access denied" message. His mind felt fuzzy with fatigue, a jumble of disconnected facts about Julian Croft. He thought about the interviews, the enigmatic smile, the carefully constructed persona. This was a man who lived in his own head, a man who built intricate puzzles for a living. His password wouldn't be simple. It would be personal. It would be something that meant something only to him. And then, that strange, resonant feeling returned. The echo from the hollow chamber in his mind. Blackwood Preparatory Academy. The name surfaced from the fog of his thoughts, insistent and clear. The smell of damp stone and old books. Wait, he said, leaning over Emily's shoulder. Try something else. Try something about that school. The boarding school? Blackwood? Emily asked, skeptical. Why? It's just a place he went as a kid. I don't know, Jacob confessed, the feeling of inexplicable certainty growing stronger. I just have this feeling about it. It was important to him. More than just a school. He tried to grasp the phantom memory, to give it shape. There was a motto. Something in Latin. Emily's fingers hovered over the keyboard. A school motto? Jacob, that's a long shot. Just try, he urged, the feeling now a powerful premonition. I think it was something about shadows. Ex umbra in lucem. Out of darkness into light, Emily translated softly, her eyes widening slightly. It was exactly the kind of poetic, pretentious phrase a writer like Croft would cling to. With a renewed sense of purpose, she typed it into the password field. EXUMBRAINLUCEM. She hesitated for a second, her cursor hovering over the enter key. They both held their breath. She clicked. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the screen flickered. The "access denied" message vanished. It was replaced by the clean, sterile interface of an email inbox. They were in. The shared gasp of disbelief was loud in the quiet room. They stared at the screen, a mixture of triumph and terror washing over them. It had worked. The phantom memory, the inexplicable feeling, had been real. The implications of that were a terrifying mystery for another time. Right now, they had what they wanted. They had a window into Julian Croft's private world. The inbox was a deluge. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of emails. Most of the recent ones were from his agent, Cassandra Thorne, each one more frantic than the last. Julian, where are you? Julian, the police have been in touch. Please call me. Julian, we are all so worried. There were messages from his publisher, from film producers, from interviewers. But scrolling back, before his disappearance, the traffic was surprisingly light. He was, as they suspected, a digital recluse. They scrolled down, scanning the subject lines, looking for anything that seemed out of place. It was mostly business. Contracts, edits, travel arrangements. Then, Emily's finger froze on the mouse. Jacob, look at this. She pointed to an email from an encrypted, anonymous address. There was no name attached, just a string of random numbers and letters. The subject line contained a single word, equilibrium. The email was dated the day before Julian Croft was reported missing. What do you think it means? Jacob asked, leaning in closer, his eyes fixed on the cryptic subject line. I have no idea, Emily whispered, her voice tense. But it's the only email in the last month that isn't from his agent or his publisher. With a trembling hand, she clicked it open. The body of the email was as sparse as the subject line. It contained no greeting, no sign-off, just a single chilling sentence. The transfer is scheduled. The vessel is prepared. It is time to restore the balance. The words on the screen seemed to radiate a palpable cold. The transfer is scheduled. The vessel is prepared. It is time to restore the balance. The sentence was clinical, detached, and utterly terrifying. It wasn't the rambling of a crank or the cryptic prose of a fellow writer. It was the language of a transaction, a procedure. And Jacob had a sickening, visceral certainty that he was the result of that procedure. Transfer, Emily breathed, her voice barely a whisper. Vessel. She looked from the screen to Jacob's new face, her eyes wide with a horrifying understanding. Oh my God, Jacob. They're talking about you. You're the vessel. The air in the room grew thick and heavy, charged with the implications of the message. This was not random. This was not a freak accident of nature. What had happened to him was a scheduled event, a planned transfer. The word itself conjured images of data being moved, of a consciousness being uploaded or downloaded. It was the stuff of the science fiction novels Julian Croft wrote, but this was their life. Someone, somewhere, had done this to him deliberately. The mystery that had been a confusing personal crisis had morphed into a full-blown conspiracy, and they were standing right in the middle of it. Who sent this? Jacob asked, his own voice sounding distant to his ears. Equilibrium. What the hell is that? A person? An organization? Emily clicked on the sender's address, but it was a dead end, a jumble of characters leading to an untraceable, encrypted service. Whoever had sent this was a ghost, a professional. They wanted him to know, or they were confirming an arrangement. Restore the balance. What balance? The question hung in the air, unanswerable and ominous. They immediately abandoned their broader search and focused on this single, terrifying lead. Using the inbox's search function, they typed in equilibrium. There was only one other hit. It was an email from a month prior, from the same anonymous address. The subject line was a single coordinate, a set of GPS numbers. The body of the email was, once again, a single sentence. The candidate has been selected. He matches the baseline requirements. Proceed. Candidate. Baseline requirements. The words were sterile, scientific. Jacob felt a profound wave of violation wash over him. He hadn't just been a victim of circumstance, he had been chosen. Selected. For what? To be a vessel for another man's face? Or something more? He thought about his sales route, his predictable schedule, the anonymity of his life on the road. He had been the perfect target, unremarkable, transient, a man nobody would look too closely at if he seemed a little off. Someone had studied him. Someone had decided he was a suitable candidate. They were watching you, Emily said, verbalizing his own fear. They knew where you'd be. They chose you specifically, Jacob. The walls of their home, which had felt like a prison, now felt like the only safe place in the world. The faceless entity known as Equilibrium was out there, and they had already proven they could get to him, even in a locked motel room. The fear was no longer a vague sense of dread. It now had a name, even if that name was a pseudonym. They spent the next several hours dissecting the two emails, searching for any hidden meaning. They plugged the GPS coordinates into an online map. The location that appeared on the screen was a desolate, empty stretch of desert in Nevada, miles from any town or even a paved road. There was nothing there. No buildings, no landmarks, just sand and scrub brush. Why would they send him coordinates to the middle of nowhere? Emily wondered aloud, zooming in and out of the satellite image. Maybe it's not about what's there now, Jacob suggested, his mind racing, trying to think like the novelist whose face he wore. Maybe it's about what was there, or what's under there. A meeting place, a laboratory. The speculation was spiraling into the realm of fantasy, but their reality was already so far beyond the plausible that no theory seemed too wild. They printed the emails and the map of the coordinates, the first tangible pieces of evidence in their impossible investigation. The discovery had changed the atmosphere in the house. The shared purpose was still there, but it was now underscored by a new, sharper fear. They were no longer just solving a mystery. They were potentially going up against a powerful, shadowy organization that was capable of things Jacob's mind could barely comprehend. They spoke in hushed tones, as if the walls themselves might be listening. Every creak of the floorboards, every car that passed on the street outside, was a potential threat. Late that night, unable to sleep, Jacob found himself back in the war room, staring at the screen. He opened a new browser tab and, on a morbid impulse, searched for Julian Croft's novels again. He looked at the covers, at the dark, evocative titles. Shadow Self. The man who wasn't there. He had been so focused on Croft's life, he hadn't considered the most obvious place a writer might hide his secrets, his work. He clicked on the online bookstore page for Croft's most famous novel, The Echo of a Face, and began to read the free sample chapters. The book was about a man who commits the perfect murder, only to find that he is slowly, inexplicably, beginning to look like the man he killed. He takes on his victim's mannerisms, his memories, his very identity. It was fiction. It was a thriller. But as Jacob read the chillingly familiar prose, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just reading a novel. He was reading a confession, or a warning. Buried deep in the second chapter, the protagonist discusses his philosophy, his belief in a concept he calls existential equilibrium. He argues that for every action, there must be an equal and opposite reaction, not just in physics, but in human identity. To create a void, you must fill it. To erase a man, you must become him. To restore the balance. Jacob's blood ran cold. It was there. The word. Equilibrium. It wasn't just a random code name. It was a concept from Julian Croft's own book. Was this whole thing a twisted game of life imitating art? Or was Croft's fiction a blueprint for a terrifying reality he was involved in? And the most chilling question of all, if Julian Croft knew about equilibrium, was he their partner? Or was he their first victim? The discovery of the word equilibrium in Julian Croft's novel changed the very nature of their investigation. It was a Rosetta Stone, a key that suggested the answers they sought weren't just hidden in his private life, but were screaming from the pages of his published work, disguised as fiction. The war room transformed. Piles of printed-out articles were pushed aside, replaced by the digital glow of ebooks. They weren't just looking for clues anymore, they were performing literary forensics. He was telling us, Jacob said, his voice a mixture of awe and horror as he paced the room. He was putting it all out there, right in front of everyone, and nobody saw it. They called it brilliant fiction, but it was a blueprint. Emily, ever practical, was already making a list. Okay, new keywords. We search all his books for equilibrium, transfer, vessel, balance, the Blackwood School, the coordinates in Nevada, anything that feels like it could be a parallel. They divided the labor, each tackling a different one of Croft's novels, their eyes scanning the text not for plot or character, but for code. It was a surreal experience. Jacob found himself reading stories of stolen identities and fractured minds, all while wearing the face of the man who wrote them. The psychological weight of it was immense. The line between the fiction on the page and the reality of his situation was becoming terrifyingly thin. At times, a passage would feel so deeply, personally familiar that he'd have to stop, his heart pounding, grappling with a phantom sensation that he was remembering the words, not reading them for the first time. 4 hours, they found nothing concrete. The themes were there, certainly. Every book was a labyrinth of paranoia, doppelgangers, and conspiracies lurking just beneath the surface of everyday life. Croft was obsessed with the idea that identity was not a fixed point, but a fluid, fragile construct that could be altered, stolen, or erased entirely. He was a master at making the reader question reality, and now Jacob understood why. He wasn't just imagining it, he was documenting it. The breakthrough came from Emily. She was reading Croft's second novel, a complex spy thriller called The Janus Protocol. "Jacob, you need to see this," she said, her voice tight with excitement. "Listen." The main character is trying to find the headquarters of a secret organization called the Dialectic. And he finds a clue in an old letter. She read aloud from the screen. It is not a place you can find on a map of the world as it is, but rather on a map of the world as it was. The ghost of a name on the ghost of a road. Look to the history of the atom, where the desert first learned to burn. Jacob stopped pacing. The history of the atom. The desert. The Nevada test site, Emily said, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she opened a new browser window. The atomic bomb tests in the 1950s. That's right near the coordinates they sent Croft. A ghost of a name on the ghost of a road, Jacob repeated the line, his mind racing. The old test sites had names. The roads leading to them were often decommissioned. They're ghost roads now. Emily quickly cross-referenced a historical map of the Nevada test site with the modern satellite image of the coordinates. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was the clicking of her mouse. Then she gasped. "Oh my God! Jacob!" She turned the laptop screen towards him. She had overlaid the old map on top of the new one. The coordinates from the email, which appeared to be in the middle of a barren, featureless plain on the current map, fell directly on top of a faded, dotted line on the historical one. It was a decommissioned service road. And next to it, in faint, almost unreadable print, was a label for a specific testing area. It was called Project Blackwood. The name hit Jacob with the force of a physical impact. Blackwood, the boarding school in Vermont. The name that had resonated so deeply with him. It wasn't just the school. It was here, in the middle of the Nevada desert, linked to the atomic bomb and a secret organization in a Julian Croft novel. It was a thread, a powerful, undeniable connection weaving the disparate parts of this mystery together. It couldn't be a coincidence. It was a deliberate echo, a signpost. He was leading them, Jacob whispered. Or he was leaving a trail for someone to follow. What was at Project Blackwood? Emily's search was already underway. She found a handful of declassified government documents and historical articles. Project Blackwood was an obscure, underfunded sub-project from the late 1950s. Officially, its purpose was to study the psychological effects of extreme isolation and sensory deprivation on soldiers in a simulated post-nuclear bunker environment. The facility was built underground to enhance the simulation. But the project was abruptly shut down in the early 60s, the facility abandoned, and the record sealed for decades, citing unforeseen and ethically compromising results. Ethically compromising results. Emily read from a historical summary. What does that mean? What were they really doing out there? They stared at each other, the same terrifying thought reflected in their eyes. An underground bunker. A secret project studying the mind. A location connected to Julian Croft's past and to the mysterious organization, Equilibrium. It was the X on the map. They had found the place where the fiction and the reality converged. This is it, Jacob said, a cold certainty settling in his gut. Whatever they did to me, whatever Equilibrium is, the answer is there. In that bunker. The revelation was a terrifying milestone. They had moved beyond the digital world, beyond the realm of research and speculation. They had a physical location. A destination, but the knowledge was a double-edged sword. The war room had been a safe, if claustrophobic, bunker. The desert was the outside world, a world where Julian Croft's face was a liability, a world where the people who had done this to him might still be operating. So what do we do now? Emily asked, her voice quiet, but Jacob could see the fear and resolve battling in her eyes. We can't just go there. Can we afford not to? He countered. We're trapped here and hiding. This is the only real lead we have. It's the only chance we have of finding out the truth and getting my life back. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of their decision. Leaving the house meant risking everything. Exposure, capture, confronting the people responsible for this nightmare. But staying meant suffocating, living in a permanent state of fear and uncertainty, a ghost in his own life. He looked at the map on the screen, at the desolate patch of desert where a secret was buried. It was the most dangerous place he could possibly go, and he knew, with a terrifying clarity, that he had to go there. The decision to go to Nevada hung in the air between them, a tangible thing. It was one thing to say the words, to feel the intellectual certainty that the answer lay in the desert. It was another thing entirely to plan the logistics of such a reckless journey. The moment they agreed to go, the relative safety of their self-imposed prison evaporated, replaced by the chilling reality of the dangers outside. For the first time in a week, they had to think about the world beyond their front door, a world where Jacob's face was a ticking time bomb. We can't fly, Emily stated, her voice firm as she switched from researcher to operational planner. She had a new notebook open, this one with a heading that read, Nevada Plan. Your ID has your old face. We can't use your credit cards, they'll track the purchases. We have to drive. And we have to use cash. The next morning, Emily ventured out alone for the first time since their ordeal began. Jacob watched from behind the blinds of the living room window as she got into her car and drove away. The sight of the quiet suburban street, the ordinary people walking their dogs and checking their mail, felt like a scene from another planet. He was an alien here, a man who couldn't show his face in the light of day. The feeling of helplessness was profound. While he was trapped, Emily had to become his public face, his agent in the real world. The guilt was a heavy weight in his chest. She returned 2 hours later with a duffel bag full of supplies. She had gone to 3 different banks in 2 different towns, withdrawing the maximum amount of cash from each to avoid raising flags. She'd bought burner phones, prepaid with cash, so their communications couldn't be traced. She'd purchased a stack of paper maps of Nevada and the surrounding states. They couldn't risk using their car's GPS or their personal phones. They had to go completely off the grid. The biggest challenge, however, was Jacob himself. We have to disguise you, Emily said, looking at him with a clinical eye. And a simple hat and sunglasses won't be enough. Your face is distinctive. It was a strange and deeply unsettling process. They stood in front of the bathroom mirror, the one he had so diligently avoided, and experimented. They had to make the face of Julian Croft, a face now burned into their minds from dozens of author photos, look like someone else entirely. Emily had bought a box of cheap, drugstore hair dye. Standing over the sink, she worked the dark, chemical-smelling goo into his thick brown hair, bleaching it to a washed-out, straw-colored blonde. The result was jarring. The light hair clashed with his dark eyebrows and the piercing blue eyes, making him look sickly and unnatural. It was a start. Next came a pair of non-prescription glasses with thick, black frames that helped to break up the sharp, recognizable lines of his face. She'd also bought a set of disposable razors. The stubble that defined Croft's rugged look had to go. Jacob lathered his unfamiliar face with shaking hands, the sensation of the razor on his skin a bizarre act of violation against a face that wasn't his. When he was done, the man in the mirror looked younger, softer, but also more generic. Less like Julian Croft, the brilliant novelist, and more like a tired, anxious man who was losing his hair. For the first time, the disguise gave him a flicker of hope. He looked less like Julian Croft, but sadly, he looked nothing at all like Jacob Miller either. He was just a new kind of stranger. They packed meticulously, water, non-perishable food, a first aid kit, flashlights, warm clothing for the desert night. Emily had even bought a shovel and a crowbar. The thought of what they might need them for was something neither of them wanted to verbalize. They were preparing to break into an abandoned, underground government facility in the middle of the desert. The sheer insanity of it was not lost on them. The night before they were scheduled to leave, an oppressive silence fell over the house. The war room was tidy, the laptop shut down, the printouts packed away. Their investigation was over. The journey was about to begin. They sat on the couch, the television off, the quiet house feeling cavernous around them. What if we find nothing? Jacob asked, the question that had been haunting the edges of his thoughts. What if it's just an old, empty bunker? What if this has all been for nothing? It won't be for nothing, Emily said, her voice soft but certain. She took his hand. We're not hiding anymore, Jacob. That's not nothing. Whatever happens out there, we're facing it. We're taking control back. He looked at her, at the strength and resilience in her face, and felt a surge of love so powerful it almost brought him to his tears. She had been his rock, his anchor in this maelstrom. She had faced the impossible with a courage he wasn't sure he possessed himself. What if we find something worse? He whispered. The truth. What if the truth is something we don't want to know? Then we'll face that too, she replied, squeezing his hand. Together. They left before dawn the next morning, under the cloak of a deep, starless sky. Jacob, in his ridiculous disguise, felt like a spy in a bad movie as he slipped out of his own back door. They took Emily's car, leaving his sedan in the garage as a silent decoy. As they pulled out of the driveway and onto the quiet, sleeping street, Jacob took one last look at the house. It was just a building of wood and brick, but it represented the life that had been stolen from him. The normalcy, the safety, the identity he had taken for granted. He was leaving it all behind, driving west into the unknown, towards a ghost road and a buried secret. He didn't know if he would ever be back. And if he did return, he had no idea who he would be. The first few hours on the road were a silent, high-strung affair. They drove west through the pre-dawn darkness, leaving the familiar suburbs of Chicago behind, each mile putting more distance between them and the life they had known. The rising sun revealed the flat, predictable plains of Illinois, a landscape that should have felt boringly familiar to Jacob, but instead felt alien. He was seeing it through different eyes, under a different sky. Every billboard, every passing car, felt like a potential threat. His disguise was a flimsy shield. The cheap, ill-fitting glasses constantly slid down his nose, and he was hyper-aware of his unnaturally blonde hair. He slouched low in the passenger seat, pulling a baseball cap down to shadow his face. He felt like a walking contradiction, desperate to be invisible, yet looking like someone deliberately trying to hide. Emily drove with a focused intensity, her eyes constantly scanning the road, the mirrors, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. They were a two-person conspiracy, cocooned in the bubble of her small sedan, the world outside a hostile territory. They didn't speak much, the silence filled by the hum of the tires on the asphalt and the low murmur of a radio playing forgotten pop songs. Their shared fear was a third passenger in the car. Their first stop was a necessity. The gas tank was nearing empty. Emily pulled into a sprawling, anonymous truck stop somewhere in rural Iowa. "Stay here," she said, her voice clipped and businesslike. "I'll handle it. Don't look at anyone." Jacob could only nod, his throat tight. He watched her get out, her movements efficient and confident as she paid for the gas in cash and quickly filled the tank. But then, she headed inside the convenience store. Jacob's heart began to pound. Every second she was gone felt like an hour. He watched the other travelers moving about, truckers stretching their legs, families on vacation, people living normal lives. He was an observer from another reality. A man in a greasy mechanic's uniform stopped to light a cigarette a few feet from their car. He glanced idly in Jacob's direction. Jacob's entire body went rigid. He stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on a crack in the windshield, praying the man would look away. The man's gaze lingered for what felt like an eternity. Was he just looking at the car? Or did he see something? Did he recognize the ghost of Julian Croft beneath the bad dye job and cheap glasses? After a moment that stretched into infinity, the man blew a cloud of smoke and walked away. Jacob let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his muscles aching from the tension. When Emily returned with a bag containing 2 bottled waters and a bag of pretzels, she saw the look on his face. "You okay?" she asked softly. "Fine," he lied, his voice hoarse. "Just nervous." "Me too," she admitted, and her simple, honest confession made him feel a little less alone. They drove on. The plains of Iowa gave way to the rolling hills of Nebraska, the landscape growing wider and emptier. It mirrored the feeling in Jacob's chest, a vast, hollow expanse of uncertainty. They drove in long shifts, only stopping for gas when absolutely necessary. They ate the dry pretzels and drank the water, avoiding diners and restaurants. Each stop was a calculated risk, a brief, tense foray into enemy territory before retreating to the relative safety of their mobile bunker. That night, they pulled into a cheap, independent motel on the outskirts of a small town in Colorado. Emily went in to pay for the room in cash, using a fake name she'd invented, while Jacob lay on the floor of the back seat, hidden under a blanket like a piece of contraband. The motel room was a perfect replica of the one where his nightmare had begun, with the same stale smell and faded, depressing decor. He couldn't bring himself to look in the mirror. He lay on top of the thin bedspread, staring at the water-stained ceiling, while Emily kept watch by the door. Sleep was a distant country he couldn't find his way to. The next day, the landscape changed dramatically. The Rocky Mountains rose up before them, majestic and intimidating. They navigated the winding mountain passes, the vastness of the scenery making their mission feel both epic and absurdly small. They were 2 insignificant people chasing a ghost, heading towards a secret buried in the heart of a continent. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, they had crossed into Nevada. The mountains fell away, replaced by the stark, beautiful desolation of the Great Basin. The sky was immense, a piercing, merciless blue. The world was reduced to shades of brown and gray, the heat shimmering off the blacktop in waves. The emptiness was absolute. They could drive for an hour without seeing another car. The isolation was both a comfort and a source of profound dread. Out here, there was no one to recognize him. But out here, there was also no one to help them. If something went wrong, they were utterly, completely on their own. Following the old paper map, Emily turned off the main highway onto a smaller, 2-lane state road. After another 20 miles, she turned again, this time onto a dusty, unmarked dirt track that was barely a road at all. The car bumped and jostled over the uneven terrain, kicking up a plume of dust behind them. "This is it," she said, her voice tense. "The Ghost Road." According to the map, the coordinates for Project Blackwood are about 5 miles down this track. Jacob stared out the window. The world was a flat, empty canvas of cracked earth and hardy, skeletal shrubs. There was nothing. No buildings, no power lines, no sign of human life for as far as the eye could see. It felt like they had driven to the end of the world. He checked the burner phone. As expected, there was no signal. They were cut off. The car crawled forward, deeper into the vast, silent desert. They were approaching the X on the map, the heart of the mystery. And with every foot they traveled, Jacob felt a growing sense of premonition, a cold certainty that they were not just approaching a place, but a point of no return. The car could go no further. The dirt track had dissolved into the desert floor, becoming indistinguishable from the surrounding cracked earth. Emily killed the engine, and the sudden, profound silence was overwhelming. It wasn't just quiet, it was the absence of sound, a vacuum that pressed in on them, broken only by the faint whisper of the wind and the frantic thumping of Jacob's own heart. They were here, the middle of nowhere. Project Blackwood. They got out of the car, and the heat hit them like a physical force. It was a dry, oppressive heat that seemed to suck the moisture right out of their bodies. The sun was a white-hot disk in a bleached blue sky. They stood for a moment, two small, insignificant figures in a vast, indifferent landscape, the scale of their task suddenly feeling immense. There was nothing to see, just miles of desert in every direction. No ruins, no fences, no signs. The facility, if it existed, was completely hidden, swallowed by the earth decades ago. "Okay," Emily said, her voice sounding small in the vastness. She unfolded the historical map and the satellite printout, placing them on the hood of the car. "The coordinates put us right here. The bunker entrance, according to the schematics in that declassified file, should have been approximately 100 yards north of the main access road, camouflaged as a geological survey marker." 100 yards north, Jacob repeated, his eyes scanning the featureless terrain. It was like trying to find a single specific grain of sand on a beach. That was over 60 years ago. It could be buried under feet of sand by now. "Look for anything that seems out of place," Emily instructed, pulling on a pair of work gloves she'd bought. "A shape that's too regular. A patch of ground that's sunken or raised. Anything that isn't natural." They began to walk, their feet crunching on the dry, gravelly soil. They fanned out, their eyes glued to the ground, the sun beating down on their necks. The minutes stretched into an hour. The initial, tense excitement began to curdle into a familiar frustration. The desert was a uniform, unforgiving expanse. Every rock looked the same, every skeletal bush a twin of the last. The sheer hopelessness of the task began to set in. What if the records were wrong? What if the entrance had been completely destroyed, erased by time and the elements? Jacob felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. The bad dye job was starting to make his scalp itch. He paused, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, and squinted at the horizon. Something caught his eye. It wasn't much. Just a slight, almost imperceptible discoloration in the earth about 50 yards to his left. A patch of ground that was a slightly darker, rustier shade of brown than the surrounding soil. It was probably nothing. A mineral deposit, maybe. But it was different. "Emily," he called out, his voice raspy from the dry air. "Over here." She walked over, her expression doubtful. Together, they approached the discolored patch. It was about 10 feet square. As they got closer, they saw that the ground here was harder, more compacted. Jacob knelt down, his gloved hand brushing away the loose top layer of dirt and pebbles. His fingers hit something hard, flat, and unyielding. It wasn't rock. It was cold, metallic, and perfectly smooth. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. "There's something here," he said, his voice charged with renewed energy. He scraped away more dirt, revealing a dark, rust-colored surface. It was a metal plate, set flush with the ground. It was the cover of something. Emily dropped to her knees beside him, and together they worked frantically, digging at the edges with their hands. The plate was larger than they thought, a solid sheet of steel at least 6 feet across. It was impossibly heavy, sealed shut by 60 years of desert grime and corrosion. At one edge, nearly obscured by rust, they found what they were looking for, a recessed handle, designed to lie flat. They returned to the car and retrieved the crowbar and shovel. This was the moment of truth. Wedging the tip of the crowbar into the thin seam around the plate's edge was brutally difficult work. The metal groaned in protest, but it wouldn't budge. They took turns, their muscles straining, sweat pouring down their faces, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The sun was relentless. The silence of the desert was their only witness. "It's no good," Emily panted, slumping back on her heels, her face flushed with exertion. "It's rusted solid. We're never going to get it open." Jacob stared at the stubborn metal hatch, frustration and despair warring within him. They had come so far. They were so close. He refused to be beaten by a piece of rust. He took the crowbar again, examining the scene. He found a spot where the corrosion seemed deeper, the metal weaker. "Together," he said to Emily. "On 3. Put all your weight on it." He wedged the crowbar deep into the weak spot. Emily positioned herself opposite him. 1, 2, 3. They threw their combined weight against the crowbar. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a deafening, groaning shriek of tortured metal, something gave. A corner of the heavy steel plate lifted by a mere inch, breaking a 60-year-old seal. A puff of dust and a wave of cool, musty air escaped from the darkness below, carrying a smell of stale, dead air and damp concrete. It was the smell of a tomb. It took them another 20 minutes of grueling effort, but they finally managed to pry the heavy hatch open far enough to slide it aside, revealing a dark, yawning hole in the earth. A set of steep concrete steps descended into a darkness so complete it seemed to have its own physical weight. They stood at the edge, breathing heavily, and peered down. They couldn't see the bottom. The beam from their flashlight was swallowed by the oppressive blackness a dozen feet down. They had found it. Project Blackwood. The place where the fiction and the reality of their nightmare converged. They had broken the seal. Now, all they had to do was descend. Jacob looked at Emily, her face streaked with dirt and sweat, her eyes reflecting the small, brave beam of her flashlight. She gave him a tight, determined nod. He nodded back, took a deep breath of the hot, desert air, one last breath of the world above, and took the first step down into the waiting darkness. Descending the concrete steps was like entering another world. The oppressive desert heat vanished, replaced by a sudden, tomb-like cold that seemed to seep into their bones. The air was thick and stagnant, heavy with the smell of 60 years of decay, a mixture of damp concrete, rusted metal, and a faint, unidentifiable chemical odor that stung the back of the throat. The heavy steel hatch scraped shut above them, a sound of finality that plunged them into absolute, suffocating darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their own ragged breathing. Then, 2 beams from their powerful flashlights sliced through the black, cutting tunnels of light through the dust-moated air. The steps ended in a small, square landing. Before them, a heavy steel door stood slightly ajar, a silent invitation into the facility's depths. Jacob pushed it open, its hinges groaning in protest. They stepped through and found themselves in a long, narrow corridor. The walls were bare concrete, streaked with dark stains of moisture. Wires and cables snaked along the ceiling, held in place by rusted brackets. Doors lined either side of the hallway, their paint peeling, small grimy windows set in their upper halves. It was exactly what it was supposed to be, a military bunker, functional, grim, and built to withstand the end of the world. Everything was covered in a thick, uniform blanket of gray dust, a silent testament to the decades that had passed since anyone had walked these halls. It was a perfectly preserved ghost ship, abandoned in a hurry. A clipboard lay on the floor, its pages a moldy, illegible pulp. A coffee mug sat on a small overturned table, a dark residue still clinging to the bottom. "It's like they just left," Emily whispered, her voice a hushed, reverent sound that the oppressive silence seemed to swallow. They moved cautiously down the corridor, their flashlight beams dancing ahead of them, revealing one scene of silent decay after another. They peered through the small windows and the doors. Most of the rooms were small, Spartan dormitories, each containing a simple metal-framed bed, a small desk, and a locker. In one room, the bed was still unmade, the sheets thrown back in a way that suggested the occupant had just gotten up. In another, a half-finished game of solitaire was laid out on the desk, the cards faded and warped with time. The further they went, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. They found rooms that were clearly not for sleeping. One was filled with racks of outdated, bulky electronic equipment, a wall of dials, switches, and gauges that looked like something from a classic science fiction film. Thick cables ran from the machines, through the walls, and into the adjacent room. This next room was an observation chamber, dominated by a large, dark pane of one-way glass that looked into a small, padded cell. A single, heavy-duty chair with thick leather restraints sat in the center of the cell. Jacob felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was where the ethically compromising research had happened. He could almost feel the echoes of the past, the silent screams absorbed by the padded walls. They continued their descent, finding another flight of stairs that led them to a lower level. This floor was different. It seemed more administrative. They found a mess hall, with chairs and tables overturned in a state of disarray. They found a communications room, the radio equipment smashed, as if deliberately destroyed before the facility was abandoned. And then, they found an office. It was larger than the other rooms, with a large metal desk and a collapsing bookshelf. Water damage had ruined most of the books and files, but one thick, leather-bound logbook, which had been on a high shelf, was remarkably preserved. Emily picked it up, blowing a cloud of dust from its cover. The label on the front read, Project Blackwood, Subject Observation Log, Dr. Alastair Finch. They opened it on the desk, the stiff pages crackling in the silence. The entries were handwritten in a neat, clinical script. The early pages were filled with jargon and data, detailing experiments in sensory deprivation and psychological endurance. But as the entries progressed, the tone began to change. The clinical detachment frayed, replaced by something more obsessive, more unhinged. Dr. Finch wrote about a primary subject, identified only as Subject Zero, who was exhibiting anomalous psychic resilience. Later entries became even stranger. Finch began writing not about psychology, but about something he called resonance transference, and imprinting consciousness onto a prepared vessel. The same chilling words from the email. This was the origin. This was the source of equilibrium's terrifying vocabulary. The final entry in the book was a panicked, almost illegible scrawl. It works. God help us, it works. The resonance is too strong. He is not just receiving, he is projecting. He is rewriting the vessel. We have to shut it down. We have to sever the connection before the feedback loop consumes us all. The logbook ended there. There were no more entries. They had abandoned the project. They had run away from whatever they had unleashed in this bunker. Shaken, they continued their search. At the far end of the administrative level was a heavy, vault-like door marked with a single word, Core. It was sealed with a large, rusted wheel. It took their combined effort, but they managed to turn it, the gears inside grinding loudly. With a heavy clank, the door unlocked. The room beyond was circular, and unlike the rest of the facility, it was not empty. In the center of the chamber sat a single, massive piece of machinery. It looked like a cross between a dentist's chair and an electric chair, surrounded by a complex halo of copper coils, emitters, and strange, crystalline lenses, all aimed at the headrest. It was the machine from Dr. Finch's logs. The one used for resonance transference. It was dusty and silent, but it still radiated a palpable aura of wrongness. But it wasn't the machine that made Jacob's breath catch in his throat. It was what was on the far side of the chamber. Against the curved wall was a bank of old metal lockers, the kind he remembered from high school. They were for the personal effects of the project staff. Most were unlabeled, but one, at the very end of the row, had a name stenciled on it in faded white paint. The name was not Dr. Alastair Finch. It was not Subject Zero. It was a name that had no business being in a top-secret government facility from the 1950s. A name that connected the past to the present, the desert to a boarding school in Vermont, and Julian Croft to this place in a way that was utterly, terrifyingly impossible. The name on the locker was Croft. The name Croft, stenciled on the locker, was an impossibility, a temporal paradox that made the hairs on Jacob's arms stand on end. Julian Croft was 42. This facility had been abandoned for over 60 years. The name couldn't belong to him. The chilling implication hung in the cold, silent air of the core chamber. This wasn't Julian's locker. It belonged to someone else. A relative. His father. His grandfather? The mystery had just deepened exponentially, its roots stretching back through generations. It has to be a relative, Emily breathed, her flashlight beam fixed on the faded white letters as if they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Julian Croft's family must have been involved in this. This is why he knew. This is why he wrote about it. A frantic urgency seized them. This locker was no longer just a clue. It was a direct link, a time capsule. The lock was a simple, old-fashioned padlock, green with age and corrosion. The crowbar that had opened the way into the bunker was about to serve its next purpose. It took Jacob only one sharp, jarring motion. The rusted metal of the lock shackle snapped with a loud crack that echoed unervingly in the circular chamber. With a shared, held breath, Jacob pulled the locker door open. The hinges screamed in protest, the sound of a long-dormant secret being forced into the light. The contents were sparse, preserved in the cold, dry air of the sealed bunker. There was a neatly folded lab coat, yellowed with age. A pair of worn leather work boots. A stack of thin, scientific journals filled with dense equations. And sitting on the top shelf, two items that immediately drew their focus: a small, leather-bound diary and a single, dog-eared paperback book. Emily reached for the book while Jacob picked up the diary. The book's cover was a lurid, pulpy illustration of planets and rockets. The title was The Star Swapper, by a forgotten science fiction author. The story was about a scientist who invents a machine that can exchange the consciousness of two beings across vast distances of space. It was the same theme, the same core idea, that Julian Croft had built his career on. This was the source, the inspiration. Jacob opened the diary. The inside cover had a name written in a confident, elegant script, Dr. Sebastian Croft. Below it, a date, 1958. Julian's grandfather, Jacob guessed. The entries were written in the same fountain pen ink as Dr. Finch's logbook, but the tone was vastly different. Where Finch was clinical and then panicked, Sebastian Croft was zealous, passionate, a true believer. He wasn't just a researcher on Project Blackwood. The diary revealed he was its architect, its visionary. Finch was his subordinate. Sebastian was the one who had conceived of the project, convincing the military it was about psychological warfare when his true goals were far more ambitious. He wasn't interested in sensory deprivation. He was interested in the very fabric of consciousness. Jacob, illuminated by the beam of Emily's flashlight, began to read aloud, his voice hushed and tense. Sebastian wrote with a fiery, poetic intensity. He didn't use terms like resonance transference. He called it the great conversation, the transcendence of the flesh. He believed that consciousness was a waveform, a unique frequency that could be recorded, isolated, and with the right technology, imprinted onto a new host, a vessel. His writings were a disturbing mix of brilliant scientific insight and pure mystical fanaticism. He believed that certain bloodlines, certain families, had a stronger, more coherent waveform. His own family, the Crofts, he believed, were prime candidates. They were, in his words, natural broadcasters. A cold dread crept up Jacob's spine as he continued to read. Sebastian's initial experiments were failures, but then he discovered a key component, a receiver. For the transfer to work, the vessel couldn't be just any random person. They needed to have a compatible, more malleable waveform. Someone whose own sense of self was, for lack of a better term, quieter, more receptive. He found his perfect receiver in Subject Zero, a young, traumatized soldier who had become completely withdrawn and catatonic after a battlefield incident. He was the perfect blank slate. The diary entries grew more and more excited. The imprinting is a success, he wrote. Finch is a fool. He sees a broken mind, a feedback loop. I see the first brushstrokes of a masterpiece. Subject Zero is no longer a hollow shell. He is beginning to echo my thoughts, my memories. He is becoming a reflection of me. This was the ethically compromising result. It wasn't torture. It was the complete and utter overwriting of a human being's identity. Then Jacob reached the final, terrifying entries. Sebastian realized the process was not perfect. The transfer was not permanent. The vessel's original consciousness would eventually begin to reassert itself, corrupting the imprint. The echo would fade. To maintain what he called existential equilibrium, the process would need to be repeated, periodically, with a new, fresh vessel. It was not a single procedure, it was a cycle. A horrifying, parasitic form of immortality. The last page of the diary was a testament to his madness. He seemed to know the military was about to shut him down. Finch had betrayed him, panicked by the implications. But Sebastian wasn't afraid. He had a contingency plan. Jacob's voice faltered as he read the final passage. His hands began to shake. Emily leaned in closer, her light fixed on the spidery script. They think they can stop this, Sebastian Croft had written. They cannot. The conversation has begun, and it will not be silenced. I have made the necessary preparations. The waveform can be stored, preserved in the core of the machine, waiting for a catalyst. The research will be passed down. My son will know what to do, and his son after him. The Croft legacy is not one of wealth or property, but of consciousness itself. The equilibrium must be maintained. And when the time is right, when a new broadcaster is ready, we will find another vessel. We will always find another vessel. We just have to look for someone with a quiet mind. Someone unremarkable. Someone like the salesman who came to the base last week, the one from Chicago with the sad, empty eyes. The final words of Sebastian Croft's journal fell into the silence of the core chamber and shattered it. The salesman who came to the base last week, the one from Chicago with the sad, empty eyes. The historical text had reached across 60 years and identified him. Not him, Jacob Miller, specifically, but his type. His archetype. The quiet, the unremarkable, the man with the sad eyes. The perfect vessel. He felt a wave of vertigo so profound he had to brace himself against the cold metal of the locker, the diary slipping from his numb fingers and falling to the dusty floor with a soft thud. It wasn't random. It was a pattern. A predatory cycle set in motion decades ago. Julian Croft hadn't been a partner in this. He was a perpetrator. A willing participant. the heir to his grandfather's monstrous legacy. He hadn't staged his own disappearance, he had orchestrated his own transcendence. He had grown tired of his 42-year-old body, or perhaps the previous imprint was fading, and he had simply followed the family instructions. Find a vessel. Prepare the transfer. Restore the balance. Jacob wasn't the first. He was just the latest. Jacob! Emily's voice was a lifeline, pulling him back from the dizzying abyss of the revelation. She grabbed his arm, her grip grounding him. Are you okay? Talk to me. He knew, Jacob whispered, the words tasting like ash. Julian Croft. He knew what I was before I even knew myself. He, or his people, they found me. They followed me. They waited for the right moment, and then they used me. I'm just a rental car. Something he's using until he decides to trade up for a new model. The anger came then, a hot, surging wave that momentarily burned away the fear. He had been a victim of a mugging, but it wasn't his wallet they had stolen, it was his soul. They had hollowed him out to make room for another man's consciousness, and the phantom memories, the feelings of familiarity with Croft's life, suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. It wasn't just a new face. Parts of Julian were inside his head, echoing in the quiet spaces of his mind. The imprint was taking root. No, Emily said, her voice fierce, her eyes locking onto his. You are not a rental car. You are Jacob Miller, and we are going to get you back. All of this, she swept her hand around the room at the machine, the lockers, the weight of the past. This is their story, their sickness. We're going to make it end. Her strength was a bulwark against his despair. She was right. The shock was paralyzing, but they couldn't afford to be paralyzed. They now understood the what and the why. Now, they had to figure out the how. Their attention turned, as one, to the monstrous machine that dominated the center of the room. It was the source, the engine of their nightmare. They approached it with a new, grim purpose. It was no longer just a strange artifact. It was the weapon that had been used against him. They examined it from every angle, their flashlights tracing its intricate, dusty surfaces. The design was a bizarre fusion of 1950s analog technology and something far more advanced and alien. The crystalline lenses seemed to absorb the light from their flashlights, glowing faintly from within. If this thing can put him in you, Emily reasoned, her mind already working the problem, then it has to be able to take him out. The process has to be reversible. It was a desperate hope, but it was the only one they had. They began to search the machine for a control panel, a power switch, any kind of interface. On the side of the main chair, tucked away behind a rusted panel, they found it. It wasn't a panel of switches and dials as they'd expected. It was a small, circular screen, dark and lifeless, and below it, a single, deep port, like an oversized keyhole. It's dead, Jacob said, his hope beginning to fade. There's no power. The whole facility is dead, Emily countered. But a place like this, a secret underground bunker, it wouldn't have run on the main grid. It would have had its own independent power source. A generator. They left the core and began a systematic search of the lower level, looking for a utility room. They found it at the end of a short, dark corridor, behind a door stenciled with a faded lightning bolt symbol. The room was dominated by a massive diesel generator, a behemoth of green-painted iron and steel. It was an antique, a relic from another age, but it had been built to last. A thick, armored cable ran from the generator out of the room and into the walls, presumably leading back to the core. A fuel gauge on the side of the machine, its glass cracked but still readable, showed the diesel tank was still a quarter full. Sebastian Croft, in his meticulous planning, had left the facility ready to be reactivated. Can you start it? Jacob asked, looking at the complex array of levers and switches on its side. I have no idea, Emily admitted, but there has to be an instruction plate somewhere. They found it bolted to the machine's housing, a brass plate with engraved instructions for the startup sequence. It was a complex, multi-step process, designed to be operated by a trained technician. It would be dangerous. If they did it wrong, they could flood the engine, or worse, cause an explosion that would entomb them in the bunker forever. For an hour, they studied the instructions, tracing the fuel lines and the electrical conduits with their flashlights, matching the diagram on the plate to the real thing. Their lives depended on getting this right. Finally, they were ready to try. Okay, Emily said, taking a deep breath. I'll handle the fuel valve and the primer. You take the main ignition switch. We have to do it exactly in sequence, just like it says. Jacob positioned himself by the large, terrifying lever marked ignition. His hand was slick with sweat. This was it. The point of no return. If this worked, they would bring the monster back to life. They would power up the machine that had stolen his identity. But it was also the only way they could hope to use it, to turn the weapon against its creator and reclaim what was his. "Ready." Emily's voice was tight with tension. "Ready," he replied, his gaze fixed on the lever. "Okay," she said. "On my mark. 3, 2, 1. Mark." At Emily's command, they moved in sync, a desperate two-person team attempting to resurrect a 60-year-old giant. Emily turned the stiff, rusted fuel valve, her muscles straining against decades of inertia. Jacob heard the gurgle of diesel flowing through the dry lines. She pumped a large priming lever, forcing fuel into the engine, the rhythmic squeak of the mechanism a lonely sound in the cavernous room. Her eyes met his across the massive generator. She gave him a sharp, tense nod. It was time. Jacob gripped the heavy ignition lever, a solid bar of cold, unforgiving steel. He took one last, steadying breath and threw his entire weight into it, pulling it down. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. The silence stretched, thick and mocking. Then, a low groan emanated from the belly of the beast, the sound of immense, frozen gears grinding against each other for the first time in more than half a century. A shudder ran through the concrete floor beneath their feet. A series of loud mechanical clunks echoed through the chamber, followed by a wheezing, struggling cough as the pistons began to move. The sound was agonizingly slow, a death rattle rather than a sign of life. A plume of dark, acrid smoke belched from an exhaust pipe, filling the room with the choking smell of ancient diesel. The machine coughed again, sputtered, and then fell silent. "No," Jacob breathed, the hope that had surged within him collapsing into bitter disappointment. It had failed. They had failed. "Wait," Emily said, her eyes fixed on the generator's control panel. A single, small light, previously dark, was now glowing a faint, flickering red. "It's trying. The ignition sequence isn't finished." The instructions said it might take a few cycles. As if on cue, the groaning started again, this time faster, more determined. The coughing sound grew into a rhythmic, chugging beat, like a monstrous metallic heartbeat slowly gathering pace. The floor vibrated more intensely. The single red light on the panel glowed brighter, steadier. The chugging grew faster and louder, the sounds merging into a deafening, continuous roar that filled the room and vibrated in their chests. The giant was waking up. Suddenly, with a final, shuddering jolt, the engine caught. The roar settled into a steady, thrumming hum of immense power. And the lights came on. It wasn't a sudden flood of illumination. A single, bare bulb in a wire cage flickered weakly above them, casting long, dancing shadows. Then another down the hall. Then another. The bunker was coming back to life, one flickering, hesitant light at a time. The oppressive darkness was pushed back, revealing the full extent of the facility's decay in the stark, buzzing glare of the emergency lighting. The stained walls, the rusted equipment, the thick layers of dust, it was all thrown into sharp, grim relief. The silence was gone, replaced by the constant, deep thrum of the generator, a sound that was both a triumph and a deeply unnerving presence. They didn't wait to see if the power was stable. They ran. Back down the corridors, their footsteps echoing in the newly illuminated space, past the empty dormitories and the horrifying observation room. They raced towards the core, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. When they reached the heavy vault-like door, they could already see a faint, pulsating light spilling from the crack beneath it. They pushed the door open and stopped dead in their tracks. The core chamber was transformed. The single, bare bulb on the ceiling cast a weak, yellow light, but the room's primary illumination came from the machine itself. The copper coils around the chair were glowing with a soft, blue energy, a low hum emanating from them that was audible even over the distant roar of the generator. The strange crystalline lenses were no longer dark. They pulsed with a gentle, internal white light, like sleeping eyes beginning to open. And the screen, the small circular screen on the side of the chair, was no longer dead. It was lit up, glowing with a calm, blue light. They had done it. The weapon was active. They approached it cautiously, as if it were a sleeping predator that might awaken at any moment. The screen was displaying a simple, elegant logo, a perfect circle, bisected by a horizontal line. The symbol of equilibrium. Below it, a single line of text blinked expectantly. It was not a request for a password. It was a statement. Biometric signature detected. Welcome, Croft. Jacob felt the blood drain from his face. The machine knew him. Or rather, it knew the face he was wearing. It recognized the genetic signature of its master. It was waiting for his command. As they stood there, frozen, the text on the screen changed. The welcome message faded, replaced by a new, terrifying prompt. It was a question, simple and direct, blinking in the silent, humming chamber. Initiate resonance transfer? Y/N. The question hung in the air, a gateway to both salvation and damnation. This was what they had come for. The chance to reverse the process, to pull Julian Croft's consciousness out of Jacob's mind. But the screen didn't say, reverse. It just said, initiate. What would happen if they selected yes? Would it complete the transfer, erasing the last vestiges of Jacob Miller forever? Or would it recognize that the primary broadcaster, Julian Croft, was not present and begin a reversal procedure? And what would happen if they selected no? Would the machine shut down? Would it go into a defense mode? They had no way of knowing. Sebastian Croft's diary had been a history of his madness, not a user's manual for his creation. They were standing at the edge of a cliff, with a single binary choice that could either save Jacob or destroy him completely. And then, as they stared at the blinking cursor, paralyzed by indecision, the machine made the choice for them. A new line of text appeared below the question, stark and unforgiving. Defaulting to primary protocol. Transfer sequence will begin in 10 o'clock. A countdown had begun. 10 minutes. On the screen, the numbers began to tick down with a calm, relentless certainty. 9:59, 9:58. They hadn't just woken the machine. They had activated a time bomb. The appearance of the countdown timer shattered their brief moment of triumph and plunged them into a new, more urgent kind of panic. 10 minutes. It was an impossibly short amount of time to decide the fate of Jacob's very existence. The calm, blue screen with its ticking clock felt like the most malevolent thing in the world, a silent executioner counting down to the erasure of a man. Primary protocol, Emily said, her voice sharp and focused, cutting through Jacob's fear. What's the primary protocol? Is it trying to finish the transfer? Or is it a diagnostic? A reset? Sebastian's journal, Jacob said, his mind latching onto the only source of information they had. Did we miss something? A diagram? A footnote? While Emily made a frantic last-ditch search of the core chamber, scanning the walls and the base of the machine for any hidden panels or instructions, Jacob snatched the diary from the floor where he dropped it. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the dense, looping script of a madman, searching for a clue, a key, anything that could help them. The steady thrum of the generator was a merciless metronome, each beat a second lost. 8:47, 8:46. The journal was filled with philosophical ramblings and technical equations he couldn't possibly comprehend. He was about to give up when his eyes snagged on a small, hastily drawn diagram in the margin of one of the last pages. It wasn't of the machine itself, but of the control screen's interface. It showed the equilibrium logo, and next to it, Sebastian had scribbled a note. The balance is the key. To initiate, press the right hemisphere. To reverse, the left. A simple, elegant binary. But reversal requires a catalyst. The original waveform must be present to provide the template for restoration. Emily, I found something, he called out, his voice tight with a desperate, burgeoning hope. It says to reverse the process, you press the left side of the circle on the screen. The left hemisphere of the logo. Emily rushed over, her own search having yielded nothing. She looked from the diagram in the journal to the glowing screen. The equilibrium logo, the bisected circle, was not just a symbol. It was the main control button. It's a touch screen, she breathed. 6:32, 6:31. But the second part of the note chilled them to the bone. Reversal requires a catalyst. The original waveform must be present. My original waveform, Jacob said, the horrifying implication dawning on him. It means I have to be in the chair. The machine has to read me to find the Jacob Miller signal underneath the Julian Croft imprint. He looked at the chair. The machine. It was a throne of violation, the instrument of his erasure. The thought of sitting in it, of willingly connecting himself to the device that had stolen his life, was sickening. The blue glow from the copper coil seemed to hum with a predatory energy, and the restraints on the chair's arms looked like hungry mouths waiting to clamp down on him. Jacob, no, Emily said, her voice filled with fear. It's a trap. What if that's what primary protocol is? It waits for the vessel to get in the chair, and then it completes the transfer automatically. What if Sebastian was lying? He was a monster, but he wasn't a liar, Jacob countered, his mind racing. He was arrogant. He documented everything. He'd want his creation to have a failsafe, a way to undo a flawed transfer. And what other choice do we have? In 5 minutes, this machine is going to do something. Sitting in that chair is the only chance we have to make sure it's the right thing. 5:14, 5:13. The logic was terrifying, but it was undeniable. This was the only path forward. He looked at Emily, at the terror in her eyes, and saw his own fear reflected there. He reached out and squeezed her hand, a silent, desperate communication. He was putting his life, his very soul, in her hands. "If I get in the chair," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor running through his body, "the machine will read my waveform. That's the catalyst. Then you have to press the left side of the circle. Not the right. The left. You have to do it, Em. No matter what happens, no matter what I do or say, you press the left side." He was terrified that once he was connected, the Julian Croft part of his consciousness, the imprint, might fight back. It might try to trick her, to stop her. Tears welled in Emily's eyes, but she nodded, her expression hardening with resolve. "I will," she promised, her voice thick with emotion. "I won't let it win." With a final, deep breath, Jacob walked towards the machine. Each step was a battle against every instinct screaming at him to run. He turned and sat down in the cold, contoured chair. It was like sitting in his own electric chair. As soon as his body made full contact, the machine responded. The hum from the coils grew louder, and the pulsing white light in the crystals intensified. A low, resonant frequency vibrated through the chair, through his bones, seeming to probe deep into his mind. On the screen, a new line of text appeared. Catalyst waveform detected. Subject designation: Miller, J. Primary imprint detected: Croft, J. Conflict detected. Initiating equilibrium protocol. The countdown accelerated. 2 o'clock, 1:59. "It knows," Emily cried out. "It knows you're both in there." Jacob closed his eyes, the resonant hum growing louder in his skull. The phantom memories surged, no longer fleeting echoes but a tidal wave of sensations. He saw the snow in the Colorado mountains, tasted expensive whiskey in a New York apartment, felt the satisfaction of writing the final words of a novel. Julian Croft's life was flooding his mind, threatening to drown the last vestiges of Jacob Miller. He fought back, clinging to the memories of his own life, his first date with Emily, the smell of his father's workshop, the quiet satisfaction of a completed sale. It was a war for his soul, fought in the space of a few seconds. "Emily now," he yelled, his voice a desperate, strangled sound. "Do it now." Emily stood before the glowing screen, her hand trembling as she reached out. The bisected circle pulsed with a calm, blue light. The right side meant finishing the transfer, letting Julian Croft win. The left side meant a reversal, a desperate gamble to bring her husband back. 010, 009. She could hear Jacob groaning in the chair, his body tense, fighting a battle she couldn't see. 005, 004. She thought of his real face, his warm hazel eyes, the mole by his ear. She would not lose him. 003, 002. With a cry of defiance, she slammed her palm against the left hemisphere of the glowing circle. 001. The screen flashed a brilliant, blinding white. The hum of the machine escalated into a deafening, high-pitched scream. A surge of energy, visible as a wave of shimmering blue light, shot from the emitters and engulfed Jacob's head. His body arched in the chair, a silent scream frozen on his face, Julian Croft's face. And then, just as suddenly, the scream of the machine died. The lights in the core chamber flickered violently and went out, plunging the room into absolute darkness. The roar of the generator in the distance sputtered, coughed, and fell silent. The entire bunker was dead. In the ringing, deafening silence and the total blackness, there was only the sound of Emily's frantic, terrified breathing. The silence was a physical blow. After the deafening high-frequency scream of the machine and the shuddering death of the generator, the absolute quiet of the dead bunker was a ringing void. The darkness was total, a profound and suffocating blackness that erased the world. Emily stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs, every nerve alight with adrenaline and terror. The acrid smell of ozone, the scent of a massive electrical discharge, hung heavy in the air. "Jacob!" she called out, her voice a thin, trembling thread in the vast, silent dark. There was no answer. "Jacob!" she screamed, the name swallowed by the oppressive blackness. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She fumbled in her pocket for the small backup flashlight she carried, her fingers clumsy and slick with sweat. After a frantic, eternal second, she found the switch. A thin, weak beam of light cut through the darkness. It was pathetic compared to their main flashlights, but it was enough. She swung the beam towards the center of the room. The core chamber was a scene of destruction. The crystalline lenses on the machine were cracked and dark. A thin tendril of smoke curled from the control screen, which was now a shattered, blackened ruin. The machine was dead, truly and finally. And slumped in the chair, Motionless was Jacob. "Oh God," she breathed, scrambling towards him. His head was lolled to one side, his body limp. The leather restraints had fallen away, their locking mechanisms apparently fried in the power surge. She reached for his neck, her fingers searching desperately for a pulse. She found it. Faint, thready, but it was there. He was alive. She gently shook his shoulder. "Jacob, can you hear me? Wake up." He stirred with a low groan, a sound of profound pain and exhaustion. He slowly lifted his head, his movements sluggish and dazed. In the weak, narrow beam of her light, his eyes fluttered open. They were Julian Croft's piercing blue eyes, but they were unfocused, clouded with confusion. He mumbled, his voice a dry, hoarse whisper. It was his voice. The voice of Jacob Miller. Not the deeper, more resonant tone of Julian Croft that he'd had for the past 2 weeks. The sound of it, that simple, familiar sound, was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. "I'm here," she said, her voice choked with a relief so powerful it felt like a physical blow. "It's me. Are you okay?" "My head," he groaned, raising a hand to his temple. "It feels empty, loud, both at the same time." He squinted at the weak light, then looked around the darkened chamber. "What happened?" "The machine." "You did it, Jacob." "I think it worked," she said, though she couldn't be sure. She didn't dare to hope too much. "But the power's out. The whole bunker is dead. We have to get out of here. Now, can you walk?" He nodded slowly, and with her help, he managed to push himself out of the chair. He was unsteady on his feet, leaning heavily on her as they stumbled out of the ruined core chamber. The bunker was a different kind of terrifying now. The flickering emergency lights were gone, plunging the corridors back into the primordial darkness they had first found. Their only guide was the single weak beam of Emily's flashlight. The journey back to the surface was a slow, arduous nightmare. Every shadow seemed to hold a new threat, every sound, the scuff of their shoes, their own ragged breathing, was amplified by the profound silence. Jacob was disoriented, his sense of balance gone. He clung to Emily, his mind a fog. He could feel a strange and violent internal war having just concluded inside his own skull, but the outcome was still shrouded in mist. The phantom memories of Julian Croft, the echoes of his life that had been so vivid just minutes before, were now gone, replaced by a painful, ringing silence. It was as if a loud, intrusive radio station had finally been turned off, leaving behind a headache and a profound sense of quiet. They finally reached the bottom of the main staircase, the one that led to the surface. Step by agonizing step, they climbed, emerging from the cold, stale air of the bunker and into the wall of heat at the top of the stairs. They stood for a moment, blinking in the thin slice of daylight visible from the partially open hatch. The main flashlights, Emily remembered. "We left them by the hatch when we came down." She found them just outside, right where they'd left them. They were heavy and reassuring in her hand. With Jacob leaning against the wall, she used the last of her strength to slide the heavy steel plate aside, flooding the stairwell with the brilliant, unforgiving light of the Nevada sun. The brightness was so intense it was physically painful after the absolute darkness of the bunker. They climbed the final few steps and emerged into the blinding daylight, gasping the hot, fresh air of the desert. They were out. They had survived. Emily turned to him, her heart pounding with a desperate, hopeful terror. This was the moment of truth. The weak flashlight beam in the bunker hadn't been enough to see, but here, under the vast, open sky, there would be no hiding the result. She needed to see his face. Her husband's face. She raised a trembling hand, her fingers brushing his cheek. He flinched slightly at the touch, his eyes still clouded with confusion, but he looked at her. And she looked at him. At his face. The straw blonde hair, a cheap and terrible dye job, was matted with sweat. The thick, black-framed glasses were slightly askew, but the face beneath them, the architecture of the bones, the shape of the jaw, the color of the eyes, it was all the same. The face was unchanged. It was still the face of Julian Croft. Her hope, which had soared so high just moments before, shattered into a million pieces. A sob caught in her throat. It hadn't worked. After all the risk, all the terror, all the fight, it had all been for nothing. He was still trapped behind a stranger's face. But as she looked at him, at the despair that was beginning to dawn in her own eyes, she saw something else. Something impossible. The face was Julian Croft's, yes. The piercing blue eyes were still blue. But in the center of his right eye, the one closest to her, a small, distinct fleck of color was appearing, blooming like a drop of ink in water. A tiny, unmistakable island of muddy, familiar hazel. The tiny fleck of hazel in the sea of blue was a paradox. It was a crushing disappointment and a defiant spark of hope, all at the same time. Emily's sob of despair caught in her throat, morphing into a choked, disbelieving gasp. She leaned closer, her eyes scanning his, searching, praying she wasn't imagining it. It was real. A tiny, miraculous imperfection. A microscopic flag of Jacob Miller, planted in the foreign territory of Julian Croft's face. "What is it?" Jacob asked, his voice still weak. He saw the shift in her expression, the war between devastation and wonder. "What do you see?" "Your eye," she whispered, her finger tracing an invisible line on his cheek. There's a piece of you. A little piece of your color is coming back." He stumbled to the car, leaning heavily on the hot metal of the door as he stared at his reflection in the side mirror. The face was still Croft's. The jaw, the nose, the scar through the eyebrow. But in the reflection of his own right eye, he saw it too. The impossible fleck of hazel. It was like a single star appearing in a vast, empty sky. It wasn't the sunrise he had prayed for, but it was no longer total darkness. The machine hadn't failed. Not completely. It hadn't been an instantaneous reversal, a magical switch back to his old life. It had been something else. It had been a catalyst, starting a process. It had killed the dominant imprint of Julian Croft and given the original waveform, the ghost of Jacob Miller, a chance to fight its way back to the surface. This fragile, uncertain hope was enough to break them out of their stupor. "We have to go," Emily said, her voice regaining its strength. "We can't stay here. We destroyed that place. Someone might come to investigate. Or worse, the people behind Equilibrium might have some way of knowing the machine was activated." They didn't bother trying to close the heavy hatch. They left it open to the sky, a gaping wound in the desert floor, a tomb exposed to the sun. They threw their gear into the car and, with one last look at the desolate place that had almost claimed them, they drove. The car bounced along the dirt track, leaving the ghost of Project Blackwood behind in a cloud of dust. The drive away from the desert was the inverse of their journey there. The paranoia of being seen was still a nagging presence, but it was overshadowed by a new, intense focus. Every few minutes, Emily would glance over at him, studying his eyes. Jacob, for the first time in weeks, found himself unable to look away from his own reflection in the mirror. They were watching for a sign, a miracle in slow motion. His head throbbed, not with a dull ache of before, but with a strange shifting pressure, as if the very bones of his skull were subtly rearranging themselves. The overwhelming noise of Julian Croft's consciousness was gone, but the resulting silence wasn't empty. It was filled with a faint, familiar hum. It was the feeling of himself. For the first time since that morning in the motel, he felt like the sole occupant of his own mind. The dissonance was still there. The man in the mirror was a stranger, but the man behind the eyes felt like Jacob Miller. They drove for hours, pushing east, back towards a semblance of civilization. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and purple, Emily pulled into a gas station in a small, forgotten town on the edge of the desert. While she filled the tank, Jacob stared into the rearview mirror, his heart pounding. Was he imagining it, or was the fleck of hazel in his right eye slightly larger? And was that another, smaller fleck appearing in his left? "It's happening," he said, his voice filled with a fragile awe when Emily got back in the car. "I think it's really happening. It's just slow." The reversal wasn't a sudden event, it was a biological process. The machine had been the trigger, but his own body, his own DNA, his own waveform, was now doing the painstaking work of reclaiming its territory, cell by cell. The question was, how long would it take? And how far would it go? Would it stop at his eyes? Or would everything, the very structure of his face, begin the slow, agonizing journey back to the way it was? That night, they found another anonymous motel. The need for sleep was a physical ache, a deep exhaustion of the body and soul. But before they rested, they stood together in the dim, fluorescent light of the motel bathroom, in front of the mirror. It was the first time they had done so willingly, not with fear, but with a clinical, desperate curiosity. The face was still undeniably Julian Croft's. But the changes, while subtle, were there if you knew where to look. The flecks of hazel were now distinct in both of his eyes, like tiny constellations heralding a new dawn. The skin around his eyes seemed different. Less tired, perhaps? The line of his jaw, was it a fraction softer? Or were they just seeing what they so desperately wanted to see? "It's working," Emily whispered, her head resting on his shoulder as they stared at the reflection, two figures bound together by an impossible ordeal. "You're coming back, Jacob. You're fighting your way back." He wrapped his arm around her, holding on to her as he looked at the stranger in the mirror who was, impossibly, becoming less of a stranger. The war was not over. He was still a man with a stolen face, a man whose life was in ruins. He didn't know if the process would complete itself, or if he'd be left as some horrifying hybrid, a permanent chimera of two identities. But for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, as he looked into those slowly changing eyes, he felt a flicker of genuine, unadulterated hope. He was not just a vessel. He was Jacob Miller, and he was coming home. The journey back east was a surreal pilgrimage. The oppressive paranoia that had shadowed their westward trip was replaced by a strange, hyper-focused vigilance. They were no longer just fugitives hiding from the world. They were scientists observing a unique and impossible experiment, with Jacob as the sole test subject. Each stop for gas was an opportunity to check their progress in a grimy bathroom mirror. Each sunrise brought the question, what would be different today? The changes were agonizingly slow, but they were undeniable. After the first day, the hazel flecks in his eyes had coalesced, swallowing up the blue until his eyes were almost entirely his own familiar, muddy hazel. The sight of his own eye color staring back at him from Croft's face was a profound, emotional milestone. It was the first piece of his true self he had reclaimed, a window to the man trapped inside. By the second day, other, subtler shifts began to occur. The scar that bisected Julian Croft's eyebrow started to fade, the tissue slowly knitting itself back together in a way that defied medical science. The sharp, aquiline nose seemed to soften, the slight crook in the bridge straightening almost imperceptibly. It was a process that should have taken a plastic surgeon months to accomplish, happening naturally over the course of hours. He was shedding Julian Croft, one cell at a time. This slow-motion transformation was both a miracle and a unique form of torture. Jacob was caught in a liminal state, a man in between faces. He was neither fully Jacob Miller nor Julian Croft, but a strange, shifting chimera. He'd wake up in the morning and not know exactly who to expect in the mirror. For Emily, it was like watching a ghost slowly materialize, the familiar lines of her husband's face emerging from beneath the features of a stranger. It was a profoundly intimate and deeply unnerving experience. They felt a fragile optimism growing between them. They had faced the monster in its lair and had won. Now all they had to do was wait for science, or whatever strange force was at work, to finish the job. They began to talk about the future, about what they would do when this was all over. Their first priority was to go home, to lock the door and sleep in their own bed for a week. They dreamed of the simple, boring normalcy that had been stolen from them. It was on their fourth day of driving, somewhere in rural Missouri, that this fragile dream was shattered. They stopped at a small roadside diner, feeling bold enough for their first real meal. Jacob, wearing his hat and glasses, took a seat in a booth in the far corner while Emily went to pick up their order to go. A small television was mounted in the corner of the diner, tuned to a national news channel. The volume was low, but a headline crawling across the bottom of the screen caught Jacob's eye. Nationwide manhunt for person of interest in disappearance of acclaimed novelist Julian Croft. Jacob's blood ran cold. He couldn't hear the report, but he didn't need to. A photo appeared on the screen. It was Julian Croft's author photo, the face that was, at that very moment, slowly fading from his own. But there was another photo next to it. It was a grainy, low-quality image, clearly taken from a security camera. It showed a man with a baseball cap and thick glasses, his hair a strange, washed-out blonde. The man was getting into a sensible, mid-sized sedan at a gas station. It was him. From the gas station in Iowa. Emily returned to the table at that moment, a bag of food in her hand. She saw the look on his face, followed his terrified gaze to the television screen, and the bag slipped from her fingers, falling to the floor with a soft thud. They fled. They left the food on the floor and walked out of the diner, their movements stiff with a renewed, electrifying fear. Back in the car, Emily pulled out one of the burner phones and, with trembling fingers, accessed the internet for the first time since they'd left Chicago. The news was everywhere. The official story was that authorities were now treating Julian Croft's disappearance as a probable homicide. A violent drifter had been identified as the prime suspect. The man, whose identity was unknown, was believed to have altered his appearance and was considered armed and dangerous. The gas station attendant in Iowa had called the police after seeing the news about Croft, reporting his strange encounter with the man who looked like the novelist. The security footage had been pulled, and now Jacob, or the version of him that had existed 4 days ago, was one of the most wanted men in America. "It's them," Jacob said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. Equilibrium. The police wouldn't release security footage that fast. They wouldn't jump to homicide, with no body and no evidence. This is equilibrium. They couldn't find us, so they've made us public enemies. They're using the entire country's law enforcement as their personal hunting party. The horrifying brilliance of it was a gut punch. Equilibrium had taken their greatest liability, Jacob's recognizable face, and turned it into a weapon against them. They had painted him as a killer, ensuring that if he was caught, no one would ever believe his insane story about a face-swapping conspiracy. He would be locked away for a crime he didn't commit, silenced forever. And the most terrifying realization of all crashed down on them: they couldn't go home. Their house in Chicago, the sanctuary they had been dreaming of, was no longer safe. It would be the first place the police, and by extension Equilibrium, would be watching. They were trapped. They were fugitives with a slowly changing face, a dwindling supply of cash, and nowhere in the world to hide. The victory they had felt in the desert turned to ash in their mouths. They had escaped the bunker, but they had just walked into a bigger, more inescapable prison. The world had shrunk to the confines of their car. The windows, which had once offered a view of an open, hopeful road, now felt like the glass walls of a fishbowl, with unseen predators circling on the outside. Every police car they saw on the highway was a potential death sentence. Every news report on the radio was a reminder that they were the nation's newest villains. The dream of returning home, of collapsing into the safety of their own bed, was dead. They drove aimlessly for hours, a single looping argument playing out between them in hushed, terrified whispers. They couldn't go home. They couldn't go to the police. They couldn't go to friends or family, as that would only endanger them and lead the manhunt straight to their door. Their cash was finite. Their burner phones had limited minutes. They were an island, and the tide was coming in. What do we do? Jacob asked, for the 10th time, the question a raw, open wound. We just keep driving until we run out of gas and money? We find a new town, get fake IDs, and spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders. And what kind of life is that? Emily countered, her voice strained with exhaustion and fear. Hiding. Always hiding. Equilibrium wins. They've already taken your face, Jacob. We can't let them take the rest of our lives, too. The slow transformation of his face had become a cruel joke. Each day, he looked more like himself. The mole below his right ear, his off button, had reappeared 2 days ago, a faint brown speck that had them both weeping with a quiet, desperate joy. His jawline had softened, the sandy blonde of his original hair color was beginning to show at the roots, and his nose was, thankfully, his own unremarkable nose once more. He was perhaps 70% Jacob Miller again. But that remaining 30% was a death sentence. He didn't look enough like Julian Croft to set off alarm bells for the average person, but he certainly didn't look like the Jacob Miller on his driver's license either. He was a man without a face the world would accept, a ghost caught between two identities. We can't run, Emily said finally, her voice hardening with a new, steel-edged resolve. She pulled the car over onto the gravel shoulder of a deserted country road, the engine ticking in the sudden silence. Hiding is a losing game. We've been reacting this whole time. We need to stop running from them and start moving towards them. Towards them? Jacob asked, incredulous. That's suicide. We don't even know who they are. We know they're connected to Julian Croft, she reasoned, her mind working with the same fierce, pragmatic energy he'd seen in the war room. And we know they have influence. They're manipulating the media, the police. You can't fight a shadow like that by hiding in another shadow. You have to drag it into the light. We need proof. We need an ally. The pieces began to click into place in Jacob's mind, a desperate, terrifyingly logical plan forming from the wreckage of their hopes. They had the story. They had Sebastian Croft's journal, which was still tucked away safely in their duffel bag. They had the knowledge of Project Blackwood. It was an insane story, but it was the truth, and it was backed by evidence. They just needed someone to tell it to. Someone with the power and the platform to make people listen. His agent, Jacob said, the name coming to his lips like a prayer. Cassandra Thorne. They had read her emails to Croft. They were frantic, filled with genuine concern. She didn't seem like a co-conspirator. She seemed like a woman who was desperate to find her missing, valuable client. She was a major literary agent in New York City. She had connections. She had a reputation. And more importantly, she had a vested interest in the truth about Julian Croft's disappearance coming out. It's the biggest risk we could possibly take, Emily said, her eyes wide as she considered the implications. Her office will be the one place they might be watching. And if she doesn't believe us, she'll pick up the phone and call the police, and it's all over. It's the only risk we can take that might actually work, Jacob countered, a spark of his old self, the determined salesman, igniting within him. We have to convince her. We have to give her the story of a lifetime, the kind of story Julian Croft would have killed to write. He grimaced at his own poor choice of words. We have to find a way to get to her, to show her the journal, to make her see the truth. The decision settled over them, heavy and final. It was a wild, desperate gambit, a Hail Mary pass into the heart of the enemy's territory. But it was better than slowly suffocating on the run. It was a choice. It was a chance to fight back. Their destination was no longer the quiet suburbs of Chicago. It was the concrete canyons of Manhattan. Emily started the car, a new sense of purpose in the set of her jaw. She pulled back onto the highway, but instead of continuing east towards home, she took a ramp heading northeast, towards New York City. They would need a plan, a meticulously crafted approach to get past the doorman of a high-rise office building and into the office of one of the most powerful people in publishing. They would have to be clever, careful, and invisible. Jacob looked at his reflection in the passenger side window as the landscape began to speed past. His face was still a strange, shifting canvas. He was a work in progress, a man being slowly reborn. He didn't know if the transformation would be complete by the time they reached New York. He didn't know if they would even make it there. But for the first time since he had seen his face on the national news, he felt a sliver of control. He was no longer just the vessel. He was the messenger. And he was on his way to deliver a story that would either save his life or end it. New York City was a roaring, overwhelming beast. After weeks spent in the vast, empty silence of the American landscape and the claustrophobic confines of motel rooms, the sheer density of the city was a sensory assault. Millions of people, millions of faces, rushed past them, each one a potential observer, a potential threat. To be a fugitive in the desert was to be alone. To be a fugitive in New York was to be naked in front of an audience of millions. They spent their last $200 on a dingy, windowless room in a cheap hotel on the far west side of Manhattan, a place that dealt exclusively in cash and anonymity. Here, in this final, grim sanctuary, they finalized their plan. It was simple, elegant, and hinged on a single, desperate gamble. That Cassandra Thorne was a woman of integrity who was more loyal to the truth than to the memory of her star client. Jacob's face was now, by his own estimation, 95% his own. A stranger on the street would not recognize him as Julian Croft. But the police, with their facial recognition software and heightened state of alert, were another matter. He was still a risk. Emily would have to be the one to make the approach. The next morning, she dressed in the most professional-looking clothes she had, which amounted to a clean pair of jeans and a simple blouse. She looked like a tourist, an aspiring writer, anyone but a woman on the run. In her tote bag, wrapped in a protective cloth, was Sebastian Croft's journal. They had prepared a package, the journal, a burner phone, and a single, typed page. The note was brief. It instructed her to read a specific marked page in the journal, the final, damning entry, and then to call the number of the burner phone Jacob would be holding. It warned her not to call the police, stating that the man she thought was a killer was, in fact, the only person who knew the truth about what had happened to Julian Croft. While Emily set off for the midtown skyscraper that housed the literary agency, Jacob took up a position in a small coffee shop across the street. He sat at a tiny table in the back, facing the wall, a baseball cap pulled low, a newspaper held up in front of his slowly returning face. Every siren he heard, every uniform he saw, sent a jolt of ice through his veins. He had never felt so exposed, so utterly powerless. His entire life now rested on the judgment of a woman he had never met. He watched through the coffee shop window as Emily disappeared into the gleaming lobby of the office tower. The minutes that followed were the longest of his life. He imagined a dozen scenarios, each one worse than the last. Security guards surrounding Emily. Her being arrested in the lobby. Cassandra Thorne taking one look at the package and immediately calling the authorities. The burner phone in his pocket felt as heavy as a stone. He stared at it, willing it to ring, praying that the call would be the one that saved them, not the one that damned them. After 27 minutes, he counted every second. The phone vibrated. He snatched it up, his hand shaking. "Hello. Is this the man who sent this package?" The voice on the other end was female, sharp and controlled, with an edge of pure steel. It was Cassandra Thorne. "Yes," Jacob said, his own voice a hoarse whisper. "Did you read it?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jacob could hear the faint sound of pages turning. "I'm reading a work of fiction," she said, her voice laced with skepticism. "The Diary of a Madman. This is an insane, elaborate prank." "It's not a prank," Jacob insisted, his desperation rising. "Equilibrium is real. Julian used their technology. He transferred himself. I'm the man he used as a vessel. He stole my face, my life." "You're the man on the news," she stated, her voice cold. "The violent drifter. The police are looking for you." "I know what the news says," Jacob pleaded. "It's a lie, spread by the same people who helped Julian disappear. They want me silenced. Ask yourself, why would I come to you? Why would I risk everything to bring you this?" He decided to play his final card, a detail he had memorized from Croft's emails. Julian had a nickname for you, one he never used in public. He called you Cassie the Lion. He said it was because you were the only one who could tame the beasts in his contracts. The silence on the other end was absolute. He had her. That was a detail only the real Julian Croft, or someone who had read his private emails, could possibly know. When she spoke again, the ice in her voice had cracked. He was afraid, she said, her voice now quiet, almost to herself. The last few months, he was different. Paranoid. He talked about his legacy, about a renewal. He said he was working on his final, greatest disappearing act. I thought he was being metaphorical. I thought it was for a book. She took a deep, shuddering breath. The police found traces of a powerful, fast-acting anesthetic in his cabin's ventilation system. Untraceable. Military grade. They couldn't explain it. They still can't find his body. There is no body, Jacob said softly. He's not dead. He's just moved on and left me to take the fall. Another long silence. The decision was being made. A career, a reputation, a life, all hanging in the balance. I have a private entrance to my building in the alleyway on the east side, Cassandra Thorne said finally, her voice all business once more. My assistant is gone for the day. Be there in 5 minutes. Come alone. If this is a trick, I will have a dozen police officers in my office before you can even sit down. The call ended. Jacob sat for a moment, the phone still pressed to his ear, a wave of dizzying, disbelieving relief washing over him. She believed him. Or at least, she was willing to listen. He met Emily in the alleyway, her face pale with tension and relief. They embraced, a quick, desperate hug. This was it. The final act. He walked to the private entrance, a simple, unmarked steel door. It buzzed and clicked open before he could even knock. He stepped inside and took an elevator to the penthouse floor. The office was a stunning panoramic space overlooking the city, but Jacob barely noticed. Cassandra Thorne stood waiting for him by her desk. She was an imposing woman, immaculately dressed, her expression a mask of intense, guarded intelligence. She held Sebastian Croft's journal in her hand. Her eyes scanned his face, seeing the strange in-between features, the man who was both a ghost and a work in progress. He had expected an interrogation, a grilling. Instead, she just looked at him, a long, appraising stare. Julian always said, she began, her voice quiet but clear, that the greatest stories are the ones that are impossible to believe, yet impossible to deny. It seems he finally managed to write his masterpiece. And he made you the main character. She gestured to a chair. Sit down, Mr. Miller, she said, her voice firm, the voice of a lion tamer. We have a great deal of work to do. It's time we wrote the final chapter of this story ourselves. Jacob sat. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he was not running. He was not hiding. The manhunt was still active. The shadowy organization known as Equilibrium was still out there. His face was not yet fully his own. The fight was far from over. But as he looked at the powerful woman in front of him, at the impossible evidence sitting on her desk, and thought of Emily waiting for him down on the street, he knew he was no longer a victim. He was a survivor, and he was finally ready to tell his story.